Hello, and welcome to Morgan Meets the Eye. My name is Evan Morgan, and I am the host of this series. So, first things first, I want to thank you all for tuning in, and I do want to encourage you all to follow me on social media. My Twitter handle is at NotSpicedRum, and my Instagram handle is at some guy named Morgan. So, make sure to subscribe to my YouTube page, and certainly keep up with this show on Apple, Spotify, or upon whichever streaming platforms it's available. So for this episode, I'm doing things a bit differently. So far I've been having libertarian guests with libertarian views. And while there's nothing wrong with that, I really want to put these principles and values to the test. So in order to do that, I've brought in Jorge, a Marxist content creator, to explain Marxism and its tenets, as well as to defend it as an ideology and address the opposing philosophy behind anarcho-capitalism. And in the other corner, we have my colleague and anarcho-capitalist thinker, Liquid Zulu. And with the three of us together, I think we have the potential for a very interesting conversation today. So before we get into that, though, Jorge, Liquid Zulu, thank you both for coming on. And where should listeners go to find your content?
People can find me on YouTube, youtube.com/liquidzulu. They can also have a course at liquidzulu.github.io. You can read the whole thing for free if you want to know more about libertarian ethics.
And you can find me on TikTok on Jorge the Vanguard, and I also have a Facebook group called the Principles of Communism. Anyone can feel free to join.
Okay, very nice. So I just want to open by addressing you, Jorge, and saying that, while we may have different viewpoints, I do have respect for anyone who's willing to defend their beliefs on this podcast. So my goal here today is, not to put anybody down or go after anybody personally, but simply to examine our world on this type of social, philosophical and economic level, just in hopes that we can, uncover the truth, really, about how our society should actually function. So I think we should start by going around and, in the most general terms possible, discuss what it is that we believe and the reasoning that has led us to our own, respective belief systems. So really, I'll go first, just to kind of set the stage here. So I would describe myself as a follower of the Austrian School of Economics first, and an enthusiast of the Rothbardian tradition of anarcho-capitalism second. So as for the latter position, years ago I used to vacillate back and forth between being a minarchist and an anarchist, but at this point, however, I would say with a firm conviction that I'm definitely an anarcho-capitalist. However, my faith in, these Austrian free market, economic principles and libertarian values has always remained constant. So anyway, as for the reasoning behind my stance, growing up, I was pretty much just an everyday, garden variety, fairly liberty-minded conservative, back as a child and as a teenager, though my libertarian views were a lot less refined than they are now. But then when I went off to college, I admittedly kind of strayed off of this path and got into socialism during my early 20s. I was drawn to socialism and policies from people such as, Bernie Sanders, just because I saw how terrible the world around me was economically, in terms of healthcare, housing, education, and, just about everything else. So at least that was how I saw things, back in 2017 and 2018. So my logic was basically the economic state in America is clearly, very inefficient and very unjust. Premise B, America is a capitalist country. Therefore, conclusion, we should put something in place other than capitalism to fix this inefficiency and injustice. So now looking back at this train of logic, I do recognize several flaws there. But the problem is that it's painfully obvious to me that there are a lot of people in this country who reject, free market libertarianism on the basis of this exact same flawed, reasoning. So around the time COVID hit, I started reading up on Austrian thinkers, and, I always cite Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson as the book that officially, converted me from socialist to Austrian economist. So it made a lot of great empirical arguments that I noticed, as far as how and why price controls tend to have results that are the exact opposite of what the people who call for these and, place these price controls tend to actually receive. So, well, yeah, they have different results than what they have intended. So anyway, I know I've been kind of been yapping on for a while here, so I'm just going to wrap this up by mentioning, a figure that I was, a big fan of during my anti-capitalist days, Andrew Yang. So I have no problem with Yang personally, but I do recall that one of his policies was to establish a system that he referred to as human-centered capitalism. And we can talk about what Yang himself wanted to do with this actual policy as a separate issue, but if we're speaking directly, in terms of semantics, I mean, I find human-centered to be kind of an unnecessary qualifier before capitalism. I mean, the way I see it is kind of that it's redundant. I don't see how any system can call itself human-centered, for example, if it doesn't respect individual property rights, or if it allows the state to rob people via taxation, or lower its people's standard of living via inflation. So, in short, it's my view that we should establish basically an anarchist society that retains laissez-faire free market principles. So, with that said, I'll hand it over to you, Jorge, and let you speak your views.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Evan. So basically, I didn't know anything about politics probably 3, 4, maybe 5 years ago, and I'm riding around with my small business owner bosses. I think two different ones. They're both Trump supporters, and they're saying a lot of things that I'm, realizing I'm not liking. Obviously, as an immigrant, as different things. I'm saying a few things that I'm not really liking too much. So I began to look into politics myself, and at first I become a Democrat for about a week, and then I realized the Democrats are actually disrupting the third parties more than the Republicans are because they're actually a threat to them. So I immediately, ditched the Democrats, and I don't remember how, but almost immediately landed on Marxism. So coming into this debate, I just wanted to mention a little bit about dialectical materialism, and then another point about uh, the fact that it's hard you can't really say socialism has failed without taking into account the economic and political and military pressure that virtually every socialist country has been placed under by capitalist countries. Meanwhile, these countries in their development have not experienced the same pressure. In fact, they've been boosted up by, colonization and different uh, methods and aspects of accumulation. So, first about dialectical materialism, I just wanted to say that I'm not sure if you guys know much about dialectical materialism. I imagine you do know a bit about it, but it's just, uh, based, of course, on dialectics and materialism. Dialectics being everything, connected, uh, full of contradictions, and also progressing, constantly evolving, basically, and revolutionizing. So, and also materialism, which says that, the world is only, there's only the material world, and anything else that exists is of the material world and not of the ideal, which usually is God. But I was looking up recently, and I think in your guys' case, the ideal is capitalism. And maybe you guys can correct me on this is wrong if I'm wrong, but I think you guys do have like a metaphysical worldview that's based around sort of like capitalism as the ideal. And if I could get, your opinion on that, that'd be great. But the second was the fact that you can't really, of course, I think I covered most of it, but you can't really talk about the failures of any socialist country without the pressure that they've been placed under by countries which themselves have not faced similar pressure in their own uh, uh, creation and development. So, and I think I also had another question additionally. Why not just capitalists? Why, what's wrong with capitalism that you have to add like a qualifier to it? Or is it sort of like Marxism Leninism, where it's a development and advancement? And then fourth, lastly, to address what you said, Evan, about systems that don't respect property rights. We actually uphold personal property rights, as Marx said in the manifesto, that personal property is actually a fundamental human right. So it's I think there's different kinds of property that can be upheld without, abstracting it to like saying that if you get rid of one type of property or one form of property that, that in and of itself is taking someone's ability away to, hold any type of property. And I think, the Marxist conception that property rights are a, historical and cultural, phenomenon is the answer to that. And then, response to that as well. I think there was three questions there. I apologize, but I'll go ahead and give the floor over now. Thank you guys.
Okay. And Liquid Zulu, what is your take in this case?
Sure. So, in philosophy, I suppose the best way to describe me is as an objectivist, and I'm also an anarcho-capitalist. I believe the two are fundamentally linked. So, if you are a consistent objectivist, you will also be an anarcho-capitalist. The reason for this is the anarcho in anarcho-capitalism. I noticed Jorge was asking about that there. Uh, what that is meaning is it is an advancement to anarchist theory by the introduction of the Austrian science of praxeology by Murray Rothbard. So that's why that's why we are anarcho-capitalists. The capitalism refers to the Austrianism because Austrian economic theory places a great deal of emphasis on the role of the capitalist and the importance of the capitalist in production. So why am I an Austrian at all? Well, Austrian legal theory is the only theory to get property theory correct. Out of all of the different theories of how the law works and what it is, the Austrians got it right with Murray Rothbard. Austrian economics is the only school to get methodological dualism correct. And so the reason why we would want to be methodological dualists is because humans are not automata. So we have actual volition. We are actually able to choose what we do. This is distinct from the Marxians, who see us as being determined by economic conditions. We are determined by which economic class we're in. That's how the way we are acting is going to be determined by that. So we are not actually choosing. We are not actually acting in that sense. So they are determinists. And this is indicative of the anti-human destruction, sort of just a total destruction of man in Marxism. So the reason why we have this destruction of man, it of course didn't originate from Marx. It goes back further than him. We see it most obviously in Hegel, I would say, where they're about dialectical materialism, where dialectics is everything is full of contradictions and it's all in constant flux. That's like, Heraclitean or whatever. But how do we get to this in Hegel? The reason why we get to this in Hegel is because we have Kant. And Kant set it up that, well, we have the phenomenal and the noumenal. The phenomenal, that's all just subjective. It's, yeah, it's about how you're perceiving things. You're warping things in themselves, and you're perceiving them in a certain way, which changes, how they are. So you can't actually know what they are in themselves. Hegel came along and said, well, why are you, you know, making reference to this thing which you can't know about, it's why are you talking about this thing which you say is completely ineffable? So he just threw away the noumenal, and then you have no real world anymore. Like it's not even a real world which you can't talk about. It just doesn't. He just completely removes it from the Kantian theory, and that's how we get to this sort of complete metaphysical and epistemic collectivism and subjectivism. So this is an anti-human mystic position fundamentally. It's I have these mystic insights that there are these different groups and they each have their own different logics. This is where we get polylogism from, because maybe they have different structures of categories of understanding or whatever. And that's how you get to the polylogism of Marxism, and also the polylogism of Nazism and all these other Hegelian philosophies. So I would say fundamentally socialism has to fail on the moral grounds by the standard of life, because humans cannot live on this view that humanity is a nothing who does not deserve happiness, and doesn't even have the choice to try and pursue happiness, and it also has to fail on economic grounds because of the economic calculation problem, which is completely unanswerable by the socialists. And I suppose I can just give a quick rundown of it. It's well, let's think. So yes, socialism involves the abolition of private direction of factors production. If you have no private direction of the factors, that means that you can't trade the factors, which means that you can't get factor prices. But if you have no factor prices, that means that you cannot perform profit loss calculations, which means that economic calculation cannot be performed. But it's economic calculation that is specifically how you determine which line of production is going to be the most economizing, right? That's how you determine the most efficient line of production. If you can't perform these profit loss calculations, you're groping in the dark. You're just making complete arbitrary decisions. It's like, should I build this car of aluminium or steel? Well, I don't really know, because I can't figure out which one would be more expensive. So it's unanswerable, and nobody has answered it since Mises.
Okay. And I guess, in response to some of the questions you were asking there, Jorge, so basically, I consider myself really an anarcho-capitalist simply because I mean, I see that as the most pure, most fully realized form of capitalism in this case. I feel as though the more state that you have in a society, the more statist a society is, the more you're going to be compromising on capitalist values. And in regards to, any distinctions between, property, I mean, I am aware of, the distinctions between private property, public property, personal property, things like that. And, my take on this, my views aren't, quite as nuanced as Liquid Zulu's, but my take on this basically comes down to, Gustave de Molinari's, he had a quote something along the lines of, private property is redundant, public property is an oxymoron. And he says, if property isn't private, then it's stolen. So I've basically always interpreted the classification of property as, private or public or personal or collectively owned as a means of kind of obfuscating the matter. So rather than, whereas I don't really recognize the subcategories of property, in the same way that a Marxist would, I see it mainly as a question of property and misinformation. But that's kind of my take on it personally. Um, Now, from here, I want to kind of start, asking some questions, really, directly to you, Jorge. And then, based upon your answers, we can have Liquid Zulu come in. And then later on, we can reverse that. And so that I would ask Zulu questions, and then you can essentially, respond to those. So first off, I've noticed that the dichotomy of materialism and idealism appears very frequently in Marxist discourse. So in this case, Marx would be the materialist, whereas, somebody like such as Hegel would be on the idealist side of that coin. So dialectical materialism tends to disregard, the ideal world and focus strictly on the physical world as it exists. So from here, in this case, how does this lead to the ideals associated with Karl Marx? In this case, and in this case, why should we also follow, materialism specifically as he, laid it out?
Sure, yeah. Well, I would just say, I would say that he doesn't discount the ideal. He would say that it is not the, uh, see, whereas like the idealists see the ideal as, like, it's usually, for example, is God, is what it says, in the encyclopedia, I believe, under idealism, in Marxist.org. But it's usually the God, and usually believes that everything comes from the idea of God. But on the other hand, Marx flips around Hegel's dialectical idealism and says that the material was the original, it was first, was the source, and then our ideas are what come from, like, we're a product of nature and our ideas are a product of us, rather than nature being product of the idea, which is usually God. If that answers your question. It's not it doesn't we don't deny the ideals. We just don't say that they're the creator of the universe, basically.
Okay. Okay. And Zulu, do you have anything to say in response to that? Or
Sure. So it seems to me like maybe I was misinterpreting Evan's question, but it seems to me like there's this sense of, well, if we're going to be like total materialists and all that, how do you get this imperative to like, oh, we should be uh, organizing society in this way. We shouldn't be having capitalism. We should be having socialism. Do you assert such an imperative? And if you don't, then what are you doing? Are you just what are the theses that you're claiming?
okay. And kind
Okay.
of going off. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you have anything you want to say to that, Jorge?
Um. Yeah. I guess I am kind of misunderstanding what the question is.
Okay, sure. So basically, I was just talking about, dialectical materialism. We recognize that it's a focus on the physical world, as it exists. It's not necessarily a discount, but it's at least a focus primarily on that world. But I'm just curious how, from this worldview, we come to Marxist concepts such as, labor exploitation and, essentially doing away with the classes in society.
Okay. Well, I think the answer to that question is that it's not really that we're focusing on it. It's sort of just which one was the creator, which one was the first. Is sort of the it's not that we don't like think about ideas or focus on ideas at all. It's just that they weren't the creator of the material. It was the material that's the creator of the ideas. But we do like focus on ideas.
Okay. Well, from that shift on, putting material before the ideal, how do we get into other Marxist ideas, that Marx is traditionally associated with, such as, the, issues resulting from the, bourgeoisie, abusing the proletariat and, essentially the abolition of, private property in favor of personal property.
Okay, well, there's a few. I think there's two things I'd like to say. That first, I would say that it's first of all, it's a materialist analysis, which means that rather than taking like a preconceived, like for example, taking your ideal to a scenario, uh, investigate the material conditions, what's actually happening, and then try to draw your conclusions from that. So, I would say that a materialist analysis, is basically essentially is what doing science is, instead of like, for example, an idealist, which would essentially be like, taking the Bible to something or taking, a preconceived, metaphysical notion to something and applying that to it arbitrarily, instead, uh, analyzing the material conditions, which is, I mean, sounds vague. I'd like to explain that better. But um, what I would also like to say is that there's two components to Marxism. There's a moral and an ethical component, and then there's simply like sustainability, like the materialist analysis sustainability component. And uh, like even if we were to conclude that the wage labor and the exploitation and the growing like disparities and contradictions and conflicts within capitalism were more unethical, they would still be unsustainable.
Okay. And Zulu, do you have anything to say to that?
Sure. So, I suppose how do you get to this ethic within Marxism? How is it grounded?
How's it grounded? I'm sorry, I think I'm a little confused by the question.
Sure. So if we have it that humans are all economic automata, they're just going to behave in the ways that are determined by their economic class and whatnot, the structure of their mind. How is it that we can get to any sort of imperative if you can't choose anything, and we have only material? There's nothing that you can, we don't have any sort of like a Platonist form of the good or anything that everybody can move towards. We don't have this metaphysical teleology anymore. Where are you getting your ethics from?
Well, I would first of all, I would object to it being like completely determinist. That goes into like I would say mechanical materialism as opposed to Marxism, which is like a dialectical materialism, which says that we do have agency, but it's shaped by our conditions. We do have, you know, uh, sort of will to a degree, but it's shaped by our conditions. No, not like a complete free will like it says in like the Bible, obviously, or I think also in you know, uh, Hop and Mises and Rothbard and all of their uh, liberty, libertarian ethics. But where is it grounded? I would say in the yeah. I don't think I've ever been asked that question before, so I'm not too sure to be honest.
Okay. So basically, we have historical materialism as well, which basically takes, dialectical materialism and applies it to social life, for example. So in this case, you know, how exactly would you explain historical materialism, and where would you cite, examples in history where we've seen, these type of Marxist principles, in at play?
Sure, yeah, I would say, for example, I think one of the best examples of this is I asked a couple ANCAPs recently if they thought capitalism would have been possible like 1,000 years ago, and a lot of them asserted that. I even asked a social democrat, and he also asserted that it would have been possible 1,000 years ago, which he later changed and said if there were different conditions, which is sort of a different question, if you understand what I mean. But yeah, so to say that capitalism would have been possible 1,000 years ago is sort of without all of the current technology and, you know, uh, current technology and various conditions that make capitalism possible, I think is an idealist conception of history. To say that, you know, and this is what Marx and Engels say about the utopian socialist, is that the utopian socialists think that, socialism only need to have been discovered by any society at any time before it to take hold. The idea itself is so powerful, but Marx and Engels say that it's the conditions which make it something possible for, uh, like, even if you had the idea of capitalism or socialism 1,000 years ago, the conditions didn't exist to make it possible. And I think this is basically what historical materialism says, or a historical materialist analysis would entail.
Oh, okay. And Zulu, what would your take on that be?
Um, so I would say that I would agree that you couldn't have capitalism 1,000 years ago, but it's not because of insufficient technology or anything like that. It's because of an insufficient philosophy, the philosophical grounding. In the year 1000 or whatever, it was profoundly Platonist. I believe this is quite a bit before Aquinas was able to rediscover Aristotle, but maybe I'm getting my dates wrong or something. But it was definitely like deep into like the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, if you want to be more of a propagandist about it. So it's the fact that you don't have this philosophy of living on Earth, living for human prosperity. You have this philosophy of your life on Earth is bad. You are a sinner just by the pure act of living. So you should try and be as close to death as you possibly can be. If this is the philosophy of the day, yeah, it's going to be impossible for you to have any sort of capitalism because the politics that are enacted in any given age are going to be determined by the philosophy. But the philosophy is not like it's self-determined. It comes about as a cause of either men thinking or evading, many men. But the philosophy is what's interesting here. So I would say this is the contention I have with the Marxist theory of history, where the Marxist theory of history is sort of like economic conditions are what are determining the course of history. You have the dialectic process over and over and over again. So it's all these economic conditions, and they're at the root. But no, it's not really the case, because what is at the root? What is actually causing men to choose certain things? Why would they choose certain things? Well, we have to ask, where does man's choice actually lie? And it lies in the choice of either thinking, i.e., actively using your reason and integrating sense data properly, evading, not doing that, actively disintegrating sense data, or drifting, just kind of like relaxing and not concerning yourself with what you're perceiving. So this is the fundamental choice that man has. Now, what is it that is so pervasive in society, so fundamental, that it would be able to cause all sorts of men, like most men, like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men, all at the same time to make a similar choice? It has to be a very fundamental idea, and the school which deals with these fundamental ideas is philosophy. So this is the philosophical interpretation of history, which we get from Rand. So I suppose if I've got to phrase that as a question, um, what would be the justification of the Marxian theory of history? That it is economic conditions which cause men to act in certain ways and cause these different eras that we have.
Uh, I guess I would just say by looking at history and seeing that, it wasn't until after these technologies and modes of productions were possible already that these philosophies came to be, were possible to be conceived by these philosophers. So I think we really agreed there, but um, kind of sounded like a disagreement.
I'm not sure we do agree. I think it's not that you require a certain level of technology for capitalism to be able to work. Like it's not like voluntary interaction and an unhampered market just does not work if you have a low level of technology. It's completely like whatever level of technology you have, capitalism is going to be more efficient than the opposite, right, of socialism. Uh,
Yeah, I would definitely disagree with that because, like, even like another example would be like in the caveman. Like, there's no possible way they could have done capitalism without, uh, for I mean, Of course, this is, according to a historical and dialectical materialist analysis, but, hunters and gatherers were a stateless, classless, a form of primitive communism, and so they had no, ability to form a state or create a private property-based system until, they discovered farming and agriculture, and the conditions became possible for it, for a surplus, which is what led to the first private based property-based system, which would be slavery.
I mean, would you prefer a hunter-gatherer society or, the modern world that we have?
Well, it's not about going back to primitive communism. It's about moving forward to modern communism. I mean,
I mean,
I've talked to some primitivists, and trust me, you don't want to mess with that kind of stuff. That's
well, I'm not sure you're very distinct from the primitivists, because it seems to me that your whole notion of private property, which you hate so much, is actually just capital goods. It is, factors of production. It's goods which are used to produce other goods. This seems like a complete war on production. It's bad for you to be producing these things. So how is that at all distinct from the primitivists who say that we should do away with these capital goods? We should do away with this private property in your terms. You just say, well, no, we shouldn't do away with it entirely. We're going to be kind of a middle ground where we'll manage it by like some almighty dictator or something. How it seems like it's the same premise here that these capital goods are actually evil. It's bad to have capital. It's bad to have this production.
uh, well, no, actually, like Marx actually does say that, capitalism creates the most, wealth, and, obviously follows Adam Smith's, analysis that it creates the most wealth and production and technology of any society, but along with it, the contradictions are just, too great. So, I mean,
What
it definitely
contradictions
wouldn't
are
say
there?
that. The main contradiction, obviously, of course, being wage labor, the extraction of surplus value from wage labor, which causes
So,
both economic, social, political, all kinds of, conflicts.
so I would say, I don't know if I should get into it now because is it okay if I get into that now, or are we doing like more just
Um,
question answer type of thing?
well, I do have some other questions down the line regarding, wage labor and,
Okay, we
surplus
can we can
value and
leave it
all of
then
that.
then.
Sure, yes. So from here, I kind of wanted to talk about the concept of value. So, Marx's economic system has often been encapsulated with the famous slogan, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. Now, I don't see how a Marxist could necessarily criticize praxeology for being vague or lacking in scientific proof, and also then, simultaneously adopt this slogan as a principle to really build a system around. I mean, if we break this down, we can take the first there from each according to his abilities. I mean, how do we measure abilities necessarily? I mean, we ourselves don't really know our own full capabilities, let alone the people around us. And the idea of a centrally planned economy determining which each individual should provide based on that individual's own respective abilities, as far as I'm concerned, is not only an impossibly complex task, but it's one that could also be used to, violate individual rights. And yet I am fully aware that, this quote does apply to the final stage of communism, which would be stateless. And, you might therefore say that there would be no central planning at this point. But if there is no central planning, who would be requesting from each according to their abilities? Would it be a free, unrestricted market? And if it's the individual himself deciding what he's able to provide in addition to what he needs from society, then we're all, primarily motivated by self-interest. You know, I mean, naturally, that individual is going to elect to produce as little as he can and consume as much as he can for his own convenience. So, I mean, the second part of the slogan being to each according to his needs. What if I say that I need a mansion in this communist society or that I need a fancy sports car or something like that? You might naturally reply that, I don't need these things. But by that logic, would nobody in the society be able to actually possess, more than the most basic essentials for survival, such as food or shelter? I mean, the fact of the matter is that people are, driven to obtain more than they actually need. So I'm curious, what the Marxist, response that would be exactly, or how, a Marxist, economy would actually, structure itself in terms of, providing what people need and what people are capable of providing.
Sure. So yeah, I would say basically like the same way that primitive communism was able to, find a way to just, produce and distribute enough for everyone. I would say, despite even the hardships that they went through with such little technology, I would say that, you know, I think that a good example for us to look at is actually primitive communism, hunter-gatherer society, um, and just basically add the technology that we have now, and the production and distribution. Uh, and it's not exact, obviously, because the scale is very different, but I think the type of, social relations that were involved in that are, and the type of production and distribution is something that would be similar. And as far as the Lamborghini and the mansion, if the resources are there, I mean, I would say everyone should go ahead and have one. I mean, how exactly we determine that? It's a great question, Usually it goes back to democracy, which can leads to even more questions, which leads to more democracy. But that is, an area that I would love to discuss more. So,
Okay, sure. And Zulu, do you have any response to that?
Sure. So I would say yeah, definitely. If you define a society working as having this primitive communism, we have a pure hunter-gatherer subsistence lifestyle, then yeah, communism does work if that counts as working. You could have a society like that where all of the factors of production are controlled by a single entity, right? That's definitely possible. But that isn't really working. I don't want to live in a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. This conversation here would be completely impossible in such a society. We'd be living all across the globe and we'd all be starving, basically, right? Fundamentally, the ECP doesn't say that it's literally impossible for you to have a communist society. What it's saying is that such a society cannot efficiently allocate means. It cannot efficiently produce. It's not possible for it to do so. There is no economy in that sense. So exactly how are you planning? If you want your communism to not be this primitive communism where you're having hunter gatherers, how exactly are you planning to overcome this hurdle of economic calculation? How are you going to perform economic calculation without private direction of the factors?
yeah, so I mean, the most, the criticism of the ACP that I found the most compelling was that it's, inherently ideological because it assumes that, uh, like it defines efficiency as, basically as capitalism. So I think it's a little too, let's say, biased towards what the end goal that it's trying to, assuming is best. It's yeah, it's basically assuming that capitalism is the best way to distribute the resources, and I would disagree with that, obviously.
Well, it's
And
not
but I think
assuming
what's
that, to be clear.
and I think
It's
what's
that's
really
the
important
conclusion.
though, yeah, no, I think what's really important though is that like are you saying it creates the greatest amount of wealth, or what are you saying?
I'm
Like,
saying
is this
that
sort of like
if you have private direction of the factors, then you're going to be more economically allocating means than otherwise because you can perform economic calculation. So you're not making an arbitrary decision as to which line of production you're choosing. You can make a non-arbitrary decision. Whereas if you don't have private direction of the factors, then you can only make an arbitrary decision. That is the central claim of the ECP. So how are you going to make a non-arbitrary decision between different lines of production if you can't perform economic calculation? Or maybe you can figure out some way to perform economic calculation without prices. So how do you resolve this issue? Do you either find some
yeah,
way to
yeah, I think my
perform economic
answer would just
calculation
be
without prices, or you find some way to make a non-arbitrary decision on which line of production to choose without economic calculation? How do you do either of those?
yeah, well, I would say that with modern technology, it's more easy for us to track and monitor and, count all the resources that we have. And so it'd be much, obviously it's still difficult to count the entire world. I don't think any system yet has been able to do that. But I think with the technology we have now, it'd be easier to track that and then distribute it according to what people, we could do democracy according to like people vote on their phones according to what people actually want instead of what makes, Jeff Bezos much richer.
All right. So there you've said you've attacked the wrong problem. You've attacked the knowledge problem there. You've said, well, we could vote on what people actually want, but this is just deciding on which consumers' goods we should be producing. Let's assume that we have some sci-fi technology. Assume whatever level of technology you want. We can know exactly what every single person wants at any time of the day. Let's just assume that we can do that. How are you deciding? How are you determining how to produce those consumers' goods?
Further democracy. People see what
So you just vote on which line of
I
production to
would I
choose.
would you see yeah, I would say this is why the socialist state and the vanguard party especially are so important, especially in socialism. The stage of socialism is to get people to a form of where they're able to, knowledgeably, efficiently use their resources and, to the best of their ability. Because, I mean, for example, to even say that you could plan them the best right now is to say that the knowledge is available and that it could be available to everyone if we wanted that to be the case.
Yes, yes, they can do so now because they have prices. They can perform economic calculation. That is the knowledge which is relevant to choosing a line of production. It's you go into your office and you do cost accounting. You determine which line of production is going to cost you the most. But you can't do that in socialism. So knowledge of how to do it now does not help you at all. So how are you determining which line of production to choose? Is it an arbitrary choice or do you have some non-arbitrary way of doing it?
I mean, I would say democracy is a bit vague and arbitrary. It has to be defined more in each case where you're using it. So I agree with you in that case a little bit, but that's basically, I think, is the case. I think, yeah, some socialists are for, like some type of market-based socialism. I think that personally think it's a bit of a contradiction, but
I would agree.
Well,
what's it?
this this actually kind of leads
I
me
would
into
agree
another
that
point.
market socialism is a contradiction.
Yeah.
Well, this actually kind of leads me into another point I wanted to speak on about the dictatorship of the proletariat stage, being the intermediate stage between the current society and the, end stage communist goal. So, this seems like, very democracy-based system here. And, as, an anarcho-capitalist, you can probably guess what, my views are on democracy. But basically, the proletariat, the way I see it, would be motivated by self-interest and the disutility of labor like anybody else. So my question is, what would stop them from also being corrupted and using their own state power to act simply for their own sake at the expense of everybody else?
Well, I mean, to a degree, I would say that's what socialism is. That's what a state is and what it's for, is for the workers to, use the state against the capitalists in order to, secure their, government and also, further their means and their ends. And, states aren't exactly there to hug people. So I would say that largely that is what the socialist state is for.
So I'm not sure I really understand your answer there. So the question was, what stops the dictatorship of the proletariat from becoming corrupted and doing various nefarious things? And your answer was, well, that's what a state is for. So are you coming out as an anarchist here? Or do you agree that the
Well,
state's
no, I
purpose is to do
mean,
nefarious things?
it depends who you ask and how you define nefarious. I mean, to an ANCAP, obviously, the entire existence of the state would be nefarious. But as far as I'm concerned, uh, I mean,
I mean, Evan used the word corrupted in his question to you. So,
right.
if is the purpose of a state to be corrupted?
No, no, I would say,
So then how would you
so
stop
from,
it?
so in my definition of corruption, how would I stop it? I mean, obviously, I think the answer would just be, what's the word? Uh, shit. Oh, shit. Uh, Shit, what does Stalin do? What's the word? Uh,
Holodomor?
Not that one. The other one. The one he didn't really do, but you guys said he did. What is it? Where he cleaned up the party? I forget the word on that one. Shit.
The purge of the kulaks or whatever? I don't know.
The purges. There you go. Yeah, that's the only way.
Okay, so you're going to be so this group, you're giving the group which were worried about being corrupted, you're giving that group the power to determine what is corruption and to purge people who are corrupt by their definition, and you think that is a good way to prevent this group from being corrupted. You don't think that's going to work at all against you, ever. What if the corrupt people end up being the purge officer?
It could.
What
No, I
happens
agree with
then?
you. It could. I agree with you. It could. I think it's still the only way, though. To be honest, like,
So we just gotta
I mean,
cross our fingers and hope,
this is
right?
not my answer, but this, like, to be honest, you could say the same thing about like the people with the private protection agencies. You know?
Yeah, I can give a good answer as to why we shouldn't expect them to be corrupted, is
Okay.
because they don't have this monopoly on force. They don't have this almighty power where they're allowed to stop anybody else from defending themselves. They're just one guy. Like
Wait,
if right now,
no, that's great. Is there someone who's allowed to have the biggest private defense agency, or is there some type
yeah,
of
you're
rule
allowed to
where
have the
like,
biggest. That doesn't mean that you have a monopoly on it. Like worst case scenario in anarcho-capitalism is the system that you're advocating for. That's the worst case scenario, but that's what you are actually going for from the beginning. I
sure,
think that's pretty good for my system.
all right,
Okay.
um, interesting. Okay.
Oh,
Yeah, but no, I agree with you. I think that it could potentially be a problem, but I think it can also be a problem in any system. So,
okay. So another thing too, I know Jorge that you would consider yourself a Marxist-Leninist. So in this case, I'm curious, why, Marxism on its own would be, not quite enough, but adding, Leninism to it, adding, Lenin's interpretation of Marxism, that would be, where it's like, Marx on itself, but Marx with Lenin, now we're cooking with gas. So, what really, makes Marxism, Leninism the ideal, ideology as opposed to, let's say, Maoism or something like that?
sure, yeah. Well, I would say, yeah, okay. Well, I would reference Stalin's, Leninism, I think is what it's called, the Foundations of Leninism, where he says that, Marx didn't live in a time of imperialism, so he couldn't have come up with a theory of imperialism, but Lenin did, and so he was able to, in real time, correctly analyze and write about imperialism and also an actual dictatorship of the proletariat, whereas Marx, got to see the French Commune and the Paris Commune. I apologize, but that wasn't a real like anything like what the Soviet Union was, like what Lenin saw, and so he was able to give much more concrete analysis of what the dictatorship of the proletariat would actually entail. I guess would be my answer. I think would be my main answer to that.
Okay. And in that case, just on another note too, I wanted to speak on, about, furthering the discussion on value. So I recognize, values nature is subjective, and we each have different perspectives and prioritize different, goods differently. So in that case, despite how much people outside of the Austrian school may want to treat economics with the same hard epistemology that they would for physics or chemistry or trigonometry or something like that, the fact remains that value cannot be measured in any cardinal sense, you know, but only really in an ordinal sense, where we might value one item more in relation to another. Now, the Marxists have historically been associated with the labor theory of value, but considering how poorly that particular theory that Marx laid out has aged, in light of thinkers such as Bombewerk or Menger or, Mises, uh, and, some others as well, how would you explain the origin of an item's value, now in 2023?
Sure. No, I still think the labor theory of value is relevant. I would disagree that it's been, overshadowed by Mises and the various libertarian thinkers. I think you can't not take into account the value of the labor, and that's sort of what the labor theory of value says. There's a definition in the encyclopedia of the Marxist.org where it says, if you go to see a movie, of course you cannot ignore the value of, if you go to see a movie about the American Revolution, of course you can't ignore the value of the culture, the history, and whatnot, but you also cannot take into account the value of the labor. So I would reference that.
So, I suppose I have a question here. Um, on this question, we have it that, well, what maybe implicit, if anything. Um, how do we get to some sort of cardinal utility? Because it seems to me the Liber theory of value is a cardinal theory of value. So if it's cardinal, is it a ratio or is it an interval measure? So I can just go over those terms. So a ratio measure would be something like length, where you have this objective 0 point, and every you know exactly what the 0 point is. So like 0 inches is the same as 0 millimeters. It's the same as 0 miles. It's all the same. It's got the same 0 point, right? And then it's just arbitrary units from that 0 point, right? Um, but an interval measure doesn't have any objective 0 point. A good example would be degrees Celsius, right? There isn't an objective point at which we arbitrarily chose when water's freezing point as being 0 degrees Celsius, right? So how does this relate to utility? Does utility have an objective 0 point, and what is that 0 point? What does it mean to have zero utility?
Yeah, I'm gonna be honest. This one is going a little over my head. So, um, I did want to ask one question real quick though, if that was all right.
Sure.
I just like if the U.S. is a capitalist country, because I believe from a Marxist analysis, the U.S. is a capitalist country because of the private property, the wage labor, and the market. So I think to just get an understanding of like, do you guys think that's correct from a Marxist analysis, or do you think that's incorrect even from a Marxist analysis? I mean, I imagine you have a different analysis of what capitalism is. Maybe you can correct me on that as well. But like, as far as a Marxist analysis, would you say that the U.S. is a capitalist country at least?
As far as Marxism is concerned, I would be perfectly willing to believe that the U.S. is considered capitalist. But I'm not a Marxist, so I don't know how they classify those terms.
Right. I would I would agree with that. I would personally describe, America as more of a corporatist than anything else. Um, I wouldn't necessarily describe it as in my definition, as a capitalist country. I mean, that's actually kind of what drew me into anarcho-capitalism in the first place, was my understanding that defining America as capitalist, America is capitalist in a much more loose term, in my view, than, some Marxists might be willing to portray it as. So kind of going off of that previous question, there is the famous line of, he who does not work does not eat. I mean, I'm sure we'd all, kind of agree with that to an extent. But this does kind of beg the further question of, how much work is required to eat, and, what kind of work is necessary, and, what type of, repayment, as far as, in this case, eating, would be appropriate regarding the amount of work that people put in. So what kind of work is necessary, that you would say? What work provides enough value to society? And what metric can we actually use to determine how somebody should be paid for their labor?
Yeah, yeah, great question. Great question. I would say, and this is, I understand how frustrating of an answer it is, but democracy is unfortunately the answer to a lot of these questions, which has to be decided at the time under the conditions. So I think, yeah, I think that particular thing I don't think is something that can be exactly predetermined. And I think there's a lot of things that can't be exact and predetermined. Like, we can look at a broad general overview of history and like try to determine which direction it's going to go. But specific details like that I think, are something that are out of the scope of the analysis of like trying to analyze and predict the movements of the class-based systems.
So, I suppose I would ask on this question, um, if we have, like you mentioned, democracy as a solution a few times now. So this is now democracy as a solution for deciding what kind of work people need to do and how much food they get and whatnot. So my question would be, what if you have a population of a bunch of Germans and they vote to decide that Jews need to work twice as hard for half as much food? Is this a just outcome? Is it unjust? If it's unjust, how so? because it followed your democracy rule.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I wanted to clarify a little bit. Proletarian democracy specifically, proletarian democracy, because there is different forms of democracy. There's, a slave democracy, there's bourgeois democracy, there's socialism, proletarian democracy. I apologize. So, yeah, I would say proletarian democracy, and that's things that align with the interests of the proletariat, the class interests of the proletariat, is what is allowed within the realm of proletarian democracy. For example, you know, um, having only allowing communist parties, but allowing maybe multiple communist parties or multiple people within different people within the party. Like, I mean, it's just like, for example, I think it's like kind of, it's hypocritical and like, I mean, you guys would probably agree, and like in the U.S. where there's like, you know, I would say capitalist parties, you guys would say, quote, capitalist parties that are only allowed their own election without allowing any communist parties and say, we have a, quote, democracy. And then Cuba does the same thing. And it's like, oh, well, that's tyranny, you know?
So on this, I have something to note that basically like this is where the mysticism starts coming in here quite heavy. And so it's like, well, the proletarian democracy, they're only allowed to do things which would align with the class interests of the proletariat. How exactly are they determining this class interest? The reason is that they basically just have this mystic insight that they have discovered through this mystic insight. What exactly is the class interest of the proletariat? But what are they actually doing in reality? Because in reality, they can't actually have these mystic insights. Fundamentally, it's based on whim. They have some whim, and they're shrouding it in this whole thing of, I have my own interpretation of what the proletariat would decide. Because the proletariat is a class, a group of people. A group of people can't have a will on anything. Only individuals are able to have wills. So it's all going to be this arbitrary whim by whoever is interpreting the proletarian democracy, so, the will of the proletariat. So on this note, how exactly do you think it's impossible for the will of the proletariat to be interpreted as wanting Jews to work twice as hard for half as much food? Do you think that's impossible
Well,
to ever occur?
just, yeah, I would say this is like a great example of why dialectical materialism is opposed to idealism, whereas idealism says that we sort of already have all of the answers, which, a lot of ANCAPs think with the private property relations is that sort of we have an eternal absolute truth for the rest of time. And I think that's is a great example of what metaphysics and idealism is. So it's a great example of why, science and why dialectical materialism is opposed to idealism, which thinks that all the answers have already been figured out. So I think there are things that we don't know yet, and that's okay. I don't think it sort of says that, means that Marx is sort of mysticism or whatever that means.
Well, I mean, it is just mystic. Like whether you know it or not, it definitely is mystic. They didn't have some rational uh, process to determine what the will of the proletariat was. They couldn't have such a process, so it has to be mystic.
Okay, so I see what's, I think we've, covered some good ground there. I kind of wanted to change gears for a minute here and kind of now shift to focusing, asking you some questions, Liquid Zulu, and then Jorge, you'd be able to essentially respond to them based on his answers. So first off, I just wanted to get into something pretty straightforward here, which is, defining the state. And I feel like a lot of the state is, defining that is a pretty intuitive, process. But, basically when I look to the definition of the state, I will tend to look to what Rothbard said in Anatomy of the State, which was something along the lines of, the organization of the political ends, which, I mean, that's technically from Franz Oppenheimer, but he said something along the lines of the systematization of, the predatory process over a given territory. Now, I feel like that's still kind of an incomplete definition. So how exactly would you define the state as, something that, we as anarcho-capitalists should be opposed to?
So basically, the state is we can get this from Hoppe's class theory, which it's wishy-washy. Like it's a vague definition, right? Because it has to be, because ultimately it's just some criminal organization, and we're trying to distinguish this type of criminal organization from other types. So what it is it's this institutionalized version of this predation, as you mentioned it. So it is institutionalized anti-productive behavior. Um, so what this means is it's not just any old random criminal who goes along and stabs someone or robs someone, because that's not really institutionalized. It's not expected that this is just a general thing across this entire area. Whereas with the state, it is expected as a general thing across the entire area that this gang is going to be predating against you, and they're going to be doing so on a regular basis. And this is just how the area is. They're sort of like almost just a feature of that area in a sense.
Okay, and Jorge, what would your response be to that definition of a state?
Well, I guess I would just have a question of like, I think you said before that like, you would have defense agencies and one defense agency could be the biggest one out of all of them and just how you would manage stopping that from him institutionalizing his power and how, I mean, his power in and of itself is not institutional.
So the way you would stop him is by hiring other insurance firms to be getting in, being a bee in his bonnet if he tries trying anything, you know. But that's how you'd stop him. You'd just stop him like any other criminal. But you know, just it would be more difficult, right? Because he's got more guns. But I mean, we really shouldn't expect this to happen all that often.
Okay, yeah, so this is something I've asked Doug a lot is so essentially like I'm guessing Ancapistan would be a bunch of libertarians coming together and pooling all of their private defense agencies into like a big one to defeat the U.S. government, or how would that work?
No, you wouldn't have to be pulling it all into one big defense agency. That seems counterproductive. What you could do is just, if we have Ancapistan in one area and the US government tries to invade, they're very quickly going to end up, you know, by mutual defense pacts and just by like everybody in this area having a different insurance firm covering them, they're very quickly going to piss off every major insurance firm within this Ancapistan, which is going to be very, very difficult for them to fight against. You know, we saw how they did against, desert people in Camarax with, a couple AKs. It didn't work, right? Um,
I'm
they
sorry, but also how are you going to build up enough wealth between the Ancaps to do this? You're not going to seize
Oh, it's
any property or
capitalism because
anything, right?
we can produce way more than you socialists can, because we can
No, I
perform
mean
economic
I
calculation.
mean like
That's where
right
we get the
now
wealth
today,
from.
like right now today against Jeff Bezos. Like how are you going to outcompete him?
By trying to repeal IP for one, because that's where he makes most of his money. So, like, are you asking like a strategic note of how do I expect that we can actually push the world in towards anarcho-capitalism?
Yes, yeah.
Well, the way we would do that is fundamentally by spreading the philosophy, because if the philosophy is spread throughout, that's the only way that you could have anarcho-capitalism. There is no other way.
Now, do you advocate for like the overnight abolishment of the state, or is it going to be like a
Yeah.
process where you enact policies that like are favorable towards anarcho-capitalism, and then it aids you on your journey against obviously the other various factions, like of course us and others.
Well, if I had a button which right now would abolish the entire government everywhere on Earth, then I'd press it a million times. I would not
Right.
stop pressing it.
Okay. But like, since you don't like, what do you like? Like what? Uh, I guess like you know, would you be against, going to the government and trying to enact policies that help libertarian causes and entrepreneurs, whatever things helps your interests, I guess
No, I
is the
wouldn't be against
question.
that.
Okay. Yeah, that was okay. That's basically my question there. Um,
Okay,
yeah.
okay. So I've noticed kind of as an observation that, it seems as though I see a lot of people making some very transparent attempts, really, to kind of trap anarcho-capitalists and kind of, I've seen them kind of trick them into saying that what they're advocating in an anarcho-capitalist world would be synonymous with the state. And what I find kind of disingenuous about, when some of these people will try this, is that they'll be kind of slipping in certain phrasing. For example, they might say that the job of a private, security agency would be to use, organized force to maintain your rule over your property. And an anarcho-capitalist might not, might agree to that without really thinking it through, they might have basically just agreed to a state. So my issue with that is basically the phrasing with the word rule in that particular example, which I see, tends to appear frequently in these types of arguments. So, for example, I wouldn't say that I rule over my property. I wouldn't say, that I rule over my car or that I, rule over my refrigerator or anything like that. I kind of just see ruling as in a context that's frequently used to rule over people. And I see in kind of a libertarian, sense, I reject the notion that, one individual can directly own one individual as, property in this case. So, at least in any legitimate sense. But on the other hand, when we bring in the state's very purpose, I would argue, or in any centrally planned economy, is to treat its own subjects as property. And, I can kind of explain where I'm going with this logic. Um, so if you're going to argue that, taxation, taxation being something that only a state can do in this case, no private agency is able to, tax or, inflate the mandated currency that they forced on society. I mean, if you defend the state and you believe that taxation is, somehow not theft, then I would argue that you implicitly have to believe that the individual is the property of the state. Because in order for the tax money to belong to the state and not to the person that's being taxed, the very person that's being taxed, himself or herself, would have to belong to the state. Because if the state owns the taxpayer, then we can kind of use the transitive law and logic, which is basically that A equals B and B equals C, so therefore A equals C. And we could say that the state owns what the taxpayer owns as well. In this case, that would be, the taxed funds. And some people might kind of deny this and say, well, you drive on the roads, so you're just paying the state back for what you owe them. And basically, my issue with this type of argument is that, the state didn't establish any legitimate property right to the road in the first place. And second, if that's the metric that we use to determine if taxation is justified or not, then, why are my taxes going to Ukraine, for example, in that case? I don't use the military equipment, and that war doesn't even have to do with my own personal defense, since it doesn't really involve the U.S. But anyway, the fundamental problem here is that the state doesn't have a legitimate right to payment if it doesn't have a legitimate right to, in this case, the means that actually produce payment. So what I'm saying here is that the public, which is obviously a collective and not an individual, couldn't in any legitimate sense, have a property right to the nebulously defined, means of production in this case. Property can only belong to an individual according to libertarian legal theory. So anyway, just as for the state, just to give it kind of an example here, let's say that, a family owned, this nice large house, but then I sent some big, goons, to kind of throw that family out of their house, so that I could own the house, despite the fact that I haven't actually paid for it, and I haven't established any, voluntary contract with the family that owned that house. So let's say from there that I started renting that house out to a couple of other families, and that rent money would not be my property in any legitimate sense, but this is really what I see as the same reasoning behind paying taxes for the so-called, services provided by the state. So basically, I know I've kind of been long-winded here, but really the question I want to ask to you, Liquid Zulu, is basically how would you essentially, how would you respond to the idea that, the means of production, should belong to the public in this case? The argument that the public should have control to the of the means of production in this case.
Well, first and foremost, I would say that it's impossible for a group to own anything because group ownership implies a contradiction. So the validation of this is basically is very short. If we imagine a set of people A through Z, they each own a stick, communally, that is, the entire group owns the stick. What is to be done about a conflict over the use of the stick between A and B? Well, if we say that A should win this conflict, that means that B did not own the stick. If we say that B should win this conflict, that means that A did not own the stick. But both options contradict the presumption that everybody in the set owned the stick. So what this really highlights is that you can't avoid conflicts when you have any, to the extent that you have group property. You could highlight this again if we imagine that Crusoe and Friday are the only people on Earth, and they each say, well, let's just both communally own every single thing on Earth, right? And then that just seems to solve the issue of conflicts for time immemorial. Then you notice the second that they come into some sort of disagreement over how a given thing is to be used, it's we actually didn't solve the problem at all. We're back at square one without any property rights. So that's how I would initially respond to any sort of notion of the public at large owning the means of production. It's just not possible. But maybe if we have an intelligent Marxist who rephrases it and says, well, they're not actually owning it in that sense. They're not actually literally owning it. But we're having a group decision-making process over it. So we're having communal direction of these factors. They don't literally own it all, because that implies contradiction. But we having a vote or anything. That's perfectly fine. And on this note, I would say it's just the economic calculation problem. If you don't have private direction of the factors, then you can't have economic calculation. With economic calculation, you're making a necessarily arbitrary choice between lines of production. So those are the issues I would have with that.
Okay, and Jorge, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I got a couple things. So first I'll respond to some of the things that you said. First, you were saying that you personally wouldn't call your fridge, or whatever you own, you ruling over it, and I think that's a bit of like an arbitrary semantical debate because I would say that I rule over my laptop here, so, and I don't think that that would be, incorrect to say. So, I would also like to say that, you said a bit about illegitimate, that so they were not inherently illegitimate, and I think that that statement in itself is inherently ideological and can only be proven by following your ideology. So I don't think you know, I don't think you provided sufficient evidence that, why someone else should follow it. And to address some of Liquid Zulu's comments, first of all, he was saying that he said that a contradiction was an impossibility, and perhaps we're just using different logical frameworks, but certainly from a Hegelian and Marxist framework, a contradiction is not something that's impossible. It's quite literally something that is possible and is happening and is contradictory. And that's sort of why I don't want to say that's why it's a different word, because obviously some there are some cases where different words mean the same thing. But I would
So
say in
so
this case,
so a contradiction would mean A is non-A. That would just be a contradiction. P and not
no,
P.
no, no, no. No, in this case, a contradiction would be something like, for example, creating the conditions. Like, for example, when uh, slave owners, organize all these slaves together in order to form profit, they have to do this, bring these slaves all together and organize them all, and that ends up leading to the slaves being able to overthrow them. He did this in order to help himself, and it also hurt him at the same time. So
Well, I'm
that's
just
where
using the
like a
term as it's
contradiction.
used in logic, as in like literally a logical contradiction. Like it can't. When
Right. I also
if you assume that the entire set owns the thing, then you arrive at a logical contradiction. Because assuming the entire set owns the thing implies that some people in the set don't own a thing.
no, I wouldn't say that was the case.
I mean, this is just how contradiction is used in logic.
Yeah, I would disagree. I would disagree with your use of it. But as far as let's see, you also said yeah, you're basically just asserting that public ownership like is an impossibility, and I think that's
I'm not just asserting it; I proved it.
well, no, I don't think you approved it.
Do
You
you want me
just
to
said
run
that the
down the proof
contradiction
again?
was a possibility. You just said that a contradiction was
Do
an
you want me to run down
impossibility.
the proof again?
No, there's no need. You said a contradiction was an impossibility, and I'm telling you that's not the case.
Okay,
So,
I think you're misunderstanding what contradiction means. Like if we
no, I
bring
think
up the
you are.
old Google box here and
No,
I
I
type in
okay.
contradiction,
Right. You realize that
see
like
here.
different ideologies and different schools of thought use terms differently, right? I mean, does that make
Okay,
sense
but
to you?
I explained to you the way I'm using it. I'm using it literally in the way it's used in logic. This is not like some sort of domain-specific definition here. I'm not using it in like this is how anarcho-capitalists talk about contradiction. No, I'm talking about contradiction as it's used actually in logic, like the
Okay,
actual
well, you know what
logical
you should
meaning of
do if you
contradiction.
wanted to know, if you really wanted to know what the Marxists have to say about contradiction, I would pull up the
I don't care what the
Marxist.org.
Marxists have to say about contradiction.
Exactly, exactly.
I'm
Okay, well,
I'm
that's my point.
explaining
That's
to
my
you
point. That's
like
all.
my it's an
Okay, well,
impossibility
you proved my
thesis.
point. You proved my point, so that's
I
fine.
did
We can
not
move
prove
on.
your point. You said that
No,
I
you
was just
did. Move on.
asserting. No, you said that I was just asserting that it's impossible for a group to own something. I did not just assert it.
Sure.
I demonstrated it by proof, by contradiction. Contradiction there
Right.
doesn't mean just when somebody does something and it fucks with them or whatever. It means
Right.
P and not P. That's what contradiction means in logic. It's a premise and the negation of that premise held simultaneously. That is what contradiction means in the way that I'm using it. So I can explain
Sure.
why this applies to the case of group ownership. If you assume that a set of people, A through Z, commonly own a stick, they all own that stick. The second there's a conflict over that stick between A and B, we have an implication that one of either A or B does not own that stick. This is a contradiction. It contradicts the premise that both A and B own that stick. These are incompatible theses.
Sure. Well, I'm ready. Ready for the next question.
Okay. So, kind of picking off from there, as far as, my next question for you, Zulu, kind of going off of what Jorge was asking, basically that the idea of, property rights in the libertarian sense being kind of, an assumption, made by libertarians within that, philosophy. I tend to see this mainly as just kind of the idea of establishing property ownership through the mixture of labor and previously unowned, natural resources in this case. I would see that more as, kind of just deductive logic, really. Um, Basically, upon the fact that if we look at sort of any other, type of establishment of property ownership, let's say that I want something or that the government has provided it, um, I just don't see that there is necessarily a logical conclusion there. So basically, my question for you, Liquid Zulu, is how would you establish that, the establishment of ownership through, the mixture of labor and previously unowned resources is in fact, a legitimate epistemology to use for that?
So on this note, I would say basically the issue anarcho-capitalism tries to solve is anarcho-capitalism is a theory of what the law is. This is the fundamental point here. A lot of people mistakenly talk about anarcho-capitalism as if it's some particular system of governance or whatever, some particular bureaucratic structure. This is not the case. It's a theory about what the law actually is. So to justify why anarcho-capitalists think the law is what it is we can consider that there are basically three different ways we can answer the question of how to resolve conflicts, because this is what law is concerned with in general. Law is the subset of ethics which deals with the question of conflict. It's, okay, there are these things called conflicts. We have scarcity in this world, so we can into conflict over given scarce means, conflict meaning mutually exclusive actions or contradictory actions. How do we resolve this problem? So there are three ways you could answer this. There's the law of the jungle, which says just do whatever the hell you want, it doesn't matter, let's just completely ignore the question. There is mixed law, which asserts that, well, sometimes we should be avoiding these conflicts, and sometimes we should not. Sometimes we should revert to the law of the jungle. And then there's the non-aggression principle, which is the one anarcho-capitalists accept, which is saying don't ever initiate any conflicts. That is the third answer. So the negation of the law of the jungle is demonstrated by reference to what metaphysical premises it rests upon. So the law of the jungle is saying live by your whims, so it's whim worship. But what does whim worship rest upon? Why is whim worship wrong? Why is it wrong to worship your whims? Why is this type of mysticism incorrect? Well, it rests on the premise that of the primacy of consciousness. So it rests on the premise that if you just think something to be the case hard enough, then it actually will be the case. That is what is being said when it's saying, oh, just follow your whims, it doesn't matter, is that reality will conform to your actual consciousness rather than the other way around. And the primacy of consciousness is probably the greatest failure of any sort of type in philosophy. It is the greatest failure within the entire history of philosophy, I would say. And because it's completely wrong. It completely inverts the correct way of doing things. The correct way of doing things is having existence at the root, primacy of existence. It's like, okay, we're doing this thing called philosophy. We're trying to study existence. They completely invert this and saying we're going to recede into our minds rather than actually going out there and studying things, and we're going to think everything up. This is a complete failure, and you can see the failure of this better if you read Objectivism and the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. Um, so that's the failure of the law of the jungle. Now we can move on to mixed law. Mixed law, basically, every single mixed law system I've ever heard of has also receded into whim worship. It's an arbitrary decision of when they want to be aggressing and when they want to not be aggressing. So it's an arbitrary decision. Whim worship fails on the same grounds as the law of the jungle. But then Hoppe has come along and he's preempted any argument that could ever come out of mixed law. The way he did was with argumentation ethics. So argumentation ethics is basically saying, well, if we're not having the law of the jungle, we're actually being civilized people and sitting down and having a discussion over whether or not we should be aggressing. Well, let's think about this. Sitting down and actually being civilized and discussing, that's the NAP. So you'd have to accept the NAP before going about and proposing your mixed law system. So you're involved in some sort of inconsistency here. So he's sort of preempted any sort of mixed law system, showing that it would necessarily be inconsistent. So then we're just left with the NAP. This is argumentum in contrario. We've knocked out the alternatives, so we've only got one left, the NAP. And it's from the NAP that we validate property rights. This is how we get our property theory. So we start off by saying that, well, if Crusoe and Friday are on an island, Crusoe goes out and he takes a stick from nature. If Friday came along and tried to use that same stick to spearfish, he would be initiating a conflict over the use of that stick. So this is how we get to homesteading, that the first comer has to be the one who owns the given thing. So that, yeah, I would agree, it's not just arbitrary. We didn't just decide, we didn't assume that our property theory is correct. We actually can go about and prove it deductively.
Okay, and Jorge, do you have a response to that?
No, I do not.
Okay, sure. So in this case, you were discussing in your answer the NAP. The non-aggression principle has been, although it's, really a cornerstone of anarcho-capitalist thought, it is one that I've noticed that a lot of the general public tends to kind of, feel a bit ambivalent towards. So how could we actually apply, this principle in the real, material world in this case, in any consistent sense?
Well, I mean, we're currently abiding by the NAP right now. I don't think any of you guys are currently robbing my garage or anything. You might be, but I'm pretty sure we're all abiding by the NAP in this interaction we're having right now. This is an insight I get from Michael Malice. Almost every interaction you have on any given day is anarchist. You are not aggressing on the other person. You're not forcing them to do anything they don't want to do. It's just a very small number of interactions are non-anarchist. It's those ones we don't like. It's those ones which are aggressions that we don't like. Most things you do in the day are not aggression. So that's how you would apply the NAP. You just don't be a criminal. Just don't go around fucking people over,
Okay. So, and another question I have as well is basically going to the topic of, anarcho-capitalism basically devolving into, what is, for all intents and purposes, a state. So basically, with me, like my argument I use to justify that, private agencies are different from the state basically revolves around the treatment of human beings as property. So I know that there's kind of a dispute within libertarianism. I think some people have argued for it. I don't know if it was Walter Block necessarily, where it's people saying that, you could potentially, an individual has the right to basically sell their own consent, to basically sell themselves into slavery, which I'm personally, opposed to that. I believe that, the individual, freedom and, that actual person of somebody is not something that is, transferable through exchange to the point where it's like they can no longer consent to things after that point. But basically, I'm kind of curious what your take on that or what your, justification is behind, these private agencies, private enterprises being distinctly different from the state.
So the reason why they're different from the state is because they operate by, in Oppenheimer's words, the economic means. They are not doing things predatorially. They are doing things voluntarily. That is the fundamental distinction between them and the state. But on the point that you brought up there of the voluntary slavery thing, I think voluntary slavery is an impossibility. I don't think it's possible to own another person, but that's maybe just an aside. And people, if anybody's curious, they can read about it in my course on the lesson in self ownership. I can't remember the exact title, but it's pretty easy to find.
Okay. And Jorge, do you have a response to that?
No, sir.
Okay. So in that case, from here, I have a question I think would spark an interesting discussion. So why should we place the ideal in this case of liberty over material needs? Because some people out there are going to claim that, starving children and these, sick, disabled people, are immediate problems that are happening in the very real, here and now. And that these values that we call, property rights and freedom are basically, imaginary ideas that don't exist in the world, but really only in our heads. And as a result of that, they should come second to these material needs. So, these Marxists may argue that, problems, resulting from violating this imaginary concept of liberty, are not as serious as the moral problems resulting from leaving the needs of these people unfulfilled, causing them to suffer and die in many cases. And I know that this is a bit of a consequentialist argument, but, in this case, a lot of Marxists would say that consequentialism, is, not inherently a bad thing and something we should try to, that they may argue is the best way to live. So what would be your justification for putting that, self-ownership and liberty before the material needs of the people in society?
Sure, so I'd say on this point that it sort of rests on the assumption that poverty is caused by something. Poverty isn't caused by anything. It's the wrong question to ask what has caused all this poverty. Poverty is the default state that men are in. The real question is what causes prosperity. And the answer to that is production. But you can only have this production if you have private property rights. These property rights are a precondition for the prosperity that we're seeking. So attacking them in order to try and shortcut your way there for people who haven't produced anything, you're an anathema to the very thing that you're trying to seek. It's completely counterproductive, literally.
Okay. Jorge, do you have anything in response to that?
Yeah, I kind of think I want to respond to that with another question. Like, which of the, if any, of like the American amendments, Bill of Rights, the Constitution, do you guys follow? And can the NLRB be included in that? Like, and to what extent can a boss aggress upon his workers by disrupting their organization capabilities and various, extra legal activities?
I'm not sure I understood the second part of that, but if you're asking about which amendments I would follow, I would definitely follow the Ninth Amendment. I think the Ninth Amendment is the best, which is saying that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. This is an admission by the people writing the Constitution of natural law, that natural law is the correct theory of law, that there are indeed other rights which didn't come from the government, that which the implication there is that rights don't actually come from the government. They're just trying to write out what the actual rights are. They are not saying that these rights are coming from the government. This is the most important amendment for that reason. But can you just repeat the second point about workers or whatever?
Sure, yeah. I'm just basically trying to figure out, can it be considered aggression when if the bosses, like, when can it be considered aggression if the bosses interfere in workers' organization abilities?
When they do so in such a way that it initiates a conflict. So the boss is he's perfectly fine with firing everybody who wants to join a union. No problem there, at least not legally. The problem would be is if these workers decided, you know what, we're all going to decide we're not going to go to work tomorrow. And, assuming they're not breaking any contracts by doing that and, retaining the funds that they would have to give up and forfeit. Assuming that it's all above board and they just decide, you know what, we're all going to take tomorrow off. And then he decides, I'm going to capture them and put them in a
I'm
cage
sorry,
and force them to
you
go to
keep
work.
saying
Then that would be
law.
bad.
You keep saying following the law. And like, when you say
Yeah.
follow the law, how much of like the NAP just says the current American Constitution, we just have to follow that, whichever of
It
those
does not say
amendments
that at all.
don't.
So the
No, well, it
NEP
just says
transcends the
whichever one of
Constitution.
those amendments.
I when I brought up the Ninth Amendment, I was just saying that this is an admission by the writers of the Constitution that the Constitution is not a document enshrining that shows you what the law is. The law comes from this document. It's the Ninth Amendment is showing you that no, actually, they're just trying to write out what the law is. They're not saying that this document provides you the law. They're just trying to figure it out and put it on this document. That's what the Ninth Amendment is saying.
Interesting. What do you have to say about that, Evan?
I mean, honestly, I was basically going to say something. I was basically going to talk about John Locke and natural law in that context as well. But I mean, Zula went a little bit further than me, talking about the actual Ninth Amendment and laws as they exist in our country currently. Uh, but yes, I mean, as far as direct aggression towards employees, I would draw it basically at the point where basically if the employee no longer has an option, for example, in the workplace, let's say that if they want to go on strike and if they want to form a union, and then suddenly that the boss has essentially instituted some type of rule here where they are not able to do that, then yes, I would consider that an aggression there because he's restricting their own right to organize and um, form their own coalition within the workplace. So basically, I'm somebody who's not opposed to labor unions inherently. I believe that that's fine as long as they're voluntarily formed in this case. But yeah,
I,
that's basically just my personal take on it.
I think you made a mistake there. It's not. The question is the question of import, I should say, is not whether or not he's putting the rule in place. It's what the penalty for that rule is. Is the penalty for them forming together a labor union that he will go to their house and murder their firstborn son? Then yeah, that's
Oh, of course not.
aggressive. But is the penalty that they get fired? That's not aggression,
Oh,
right? That's
yes, I would not say firing them is aggression, because in that case, in the case of an unhampered free market, there would be other competitive agencies as well that they would also have the option to potentially go to for employment. So he's not necessarily, closing the door on them entirely.
Well, this I think perfectly gets into one of my original points was that unions, along with socialism as a whole, we really cannot discount like how much they've been affected by like like the original point I was trying to make is in this quote free market with no state aggression against socialism, it would have already long like without the Cold War, who knows what the Soviet Union would have been able to achieve, would have been able to reach. So I think uh
hunter
the
gatherer. They may have
material
gotten
like the
all the way
condition,
down.
yeah,
The,
something
the
like that.
primitive,
Or if they never
Tony
had to
Tekaczynski
militarily
could have moved
compete,
right over there. He would have loved it.
yeah, if they never had to militarily compete with the U.S. and spend all that money trying to doing space race and
Did
stuff
they
like for
have to? Did
bullshit
they
and
have to build like 50,000 nukes or whatever it was? Like some ridiculous
Mm.
number. Did they have to do that? I don't think they had to do it.
no,
Did they have to do
because
it?
that depends who you ask.
No, they
But
didn't. Plenty of other
well,
countries
I guess
didn't do it.
that depends who you ask. Yeah, I guess that depends who you ask. But I think my point still
Well, I'm
stands.
asking you, did they have to do that? Did they have to build that many nukes?
Well, I would say so. Yeah. I mean, does North Korea
Why?
need a nuke right now? I
Mm.
would say yes, because they would have been invaded had they not had it already.
Well,
Well, does it have to
why
be
do
that
all these
exact
other
amount of
countries
nukes?
get away with not having nukes? Like,
No, it doesn't have to be
does
that
it
exact amount.
what why does the USSR have to build these nukes? Why did they have no choice in the matter?
Because the U.S. is the most violent, death cult in all of history.
Okay, but so does every other country also have to build these nukes?
Well, no, not if they want to get invaded by the U.S. and controlled by them and be their puppet. They don't have to, I guess.
Australia, I don't think they've been invaded by the US. Do they have to build nukes?
Okay, I think that enough said there.
Okay.
Okay. S- Sure. And, I mean, the way I see it anyway, nukes, the nuclear arsenal that we have, the military, I'm naturally opposed to that because it is, an instrument of the state in this case. Um, in any case, there's one persistent belief that I've noticed, since the days of Marx that has remained, very constant. And basically, that's the idea that laborers are exploited by the capitalist. And we were kind of touching on that earlier, but I mean, we've all seen those political cartoons where with the pigs in the tuxedos, representing the capitalist class here. Um, so basically, in light of this, Zulu, how would you argue that labor itself is not exploited? How would you deny the idea that surplus value is being stolen from the laborer and being passed on to the capitalist in this case?
So the negation of this is basically the negation of the labor theory of value. Because this whole Marxian exploitation theory, it relies on this labor theory of value. That, these laborers, they're putting in all the work. This capitalist, he's doing nothing. That is not at all the case. The capitalist is providing a service to those he employs. And I can explain why this is the case. Even if we assume we're in the evenly rotating economy, where there is no risk or anything, then why on earth would anybody want to go and work for a capitalist? Very good reason. If they have a relatively higher time preference than that capitalist. Because the capitalist, he has to expend money at time one, and then he's not going to get any sort of return on that until much, much later. That's when he gets the return for it. So he has to value future goods relatively a lot more than people who are wanting the money right here. So the laborer, they come in, they get paid right here, right when they do the job. They don't have to wait for that investment to pay off, right? If we imagine a scenario of some guy, he has a bunch of lumber downstream, and there's a town upstream, and he's like, I reckon I can sell this lumber upstream for a bunch of dosh. I reckon I can sell it for 200 grams of gold. Sorry. So he hires 5 workers for 20 grams of gold each. So he's expecting to make a profit of 100 grams of gold from this. The laborers, they get their 100 grams gold immediately. They ship it upstream to his warehouse upstream, and then they can go off into the town and do whatever they want with their 20 grams. Meanwhile, the capitalist, he gets up to town with his lumber, where he's expecting to make a profit of 100 grams of gold off of it, and then he sees that in the meantime, he was out of town. He gets to town, reads the newspaper, and goes, oh, massive surge in lumber. We just found a brand new source of lumber. We've got way more lumber now. And he goes and checks the price of lumber, and they've plummeted. And it's like, oh, now he can only sell that lumber, which he was expecting to be able to sell for 200 grams of gold. He can only sell it for 50 grams of gold now. Right, he's made a loss of 50 grams. This represents the real world conditions of the capitalist. Not only does he let his laborers, he gives his laborers an advance on the investment. They don't have to wait for that investment to pay off. Also, he assumes most of the risk. Yeah, the laborers also have some risk, because all action has risk, right? But the risk of these sorts of investments, that is borne by the capitalist. The capitalist bears the risk of the investment itself. So it's very reasonable to work for a capitalist if you don't want all this risk, and you don't want to have to plan all this stuff out. If you don't want to have to do all of this, it's very reasonable to want to work for a capitalist who can do it all for you, right? This is a service being provided to them. So it's not exploitation. They both profit from this exchange. They both win.
Okay, and Jorge, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I have a question. Do the workers create more value than they receive through their labor?
What do you mean by value? I mean, if we're talking about like an actual understanding of value, they get more out of it than they put in, right? Or else they wouldn't do it. So we have mutual profit in any given exchange. So if I buy
But you didn't answer the question.
I'm answering it right now.
Do the workers?
I
Okay.
if I have something exchange where I pay $5 for an ice cream, and I get that ice cream, this means that I value the ice cream more than the $5. Meanwhile, the ice cream salesman, he must have valued the $5 more than the ice cream, right? So we both profit from this exchange. This is true for any exchange. So we know that the workers must have profited from choosing to work in that factory or whatever. They profit from it. So they get more out than they put in.
Okay. So in that case, then, I mean, we have noticed that, over the past, several decades, there has been an increasing shift in wealth inequality within this country. And, I think that is causing, some issues in our society. Now, one thing I have noticed is that when we look at a lot of the capitalist thinkers. I mean, I've seen. I mean, as much as I love Thomas Sowell, I do see that he is sometimes in the unfortunate position where he's defending, the income, inequality, in this case, the wealth inequality. So I personally attribute this problem more to things caused by the state, to certain state practices that were put through, particularly during the Reagan administration. And I do want to state for the record, too, Murray Rothbard was by no means, a fan of Ronald Reagan. He was actually, dead set opposed to him. So in that case, just out of sheer curiosity, Liquid Zulu, what do you believe is the origin of wealth inequality, and why do you believe exactly that it is increasing, to the extent that it has over the past several decades?
I mean, in general, if we're talking about the unhampered market, the origin of wealth inequality would be uh, disparity in the distribution of natural assets and the abilities of men. Right, this is what makes the division of labor possible in the first place. So that would cause an inequality in what specific resources people have. Um, can that be compounded by having a state? Definitely. There's going to be some sort of, if you have some sort of hampering force, this is going to slant the scales even more, right? Because there are some people who are going to be expropriating others, and we should expect them to not have to be working as hard for any given penny that they earn, because they can just send off their goons to get it for them, right? So now would be potential causes of wealth inequality. But wealth inequality as such is not a problem. It's not a problem that person A has more goats than person B. That's not an issue. Unless he's like stolen those goats or whatever. That's when the issue occurs.
Okay. And Jorge, what is your take on wealth inequality and income inequality in this case?
I would actually say that they were products, of course, of private property. On primitive communism, uh, everybody shared everything communally, owned it together. And so it wasn't until the first creation of the first state, of the first private property based system, slavery, and then feudalism, which, there was disparities between the owners and the workers, between the rich and the poor. And it wasn't until capitalism that we've seen the inequality that, like, are seeing today. And it wouldn't be possible without capitalism. And it will continue to get worse, and it is one of the contradictions of capitalism, which is not an impossibility because it's clearly happening and growing at that.
I actually agree on a point you made there, that wealth inequality is caused by private property. If we assume private property means capital goods, yeah, capital goods, the implementation of capital goods definitely does cause wealth inequality. But I don't say this with any venom. I think this is a good thing. I think it's good that some men are producers and they are able to reap the rewards of that production. I think it is bad to be this sort of altruist who thinks that, well, it's bad that they produced because they produced it, so because they produced it, they don't deserve it. I think that is profoundly evil, which is the assumption that that you rest upon when you say this with venom, that capital goods, the implementation of capital goods, that production itself is causing wealth inequality. That's what you're assuming, is that it's bad when people produce things. That if somebody produces something, they don't deserve it. It should be spread out among other people. That is evil.
Yeah, well, this is why I say that there's both the morality and then there's the sustainability argument because, and this is why Marx's, biggest, most important work, Capital, is, just a materialist analysis of capital with very few, if any, moral, indignations in it. But even if we concluded that this inequality was moral, it would still be unsustainable.
Why?
Because there's a hard limit. There's a physical amount that the rich can take from the poor, and then there's a point when they can
Whoa,
no
whoa,
longer
whoa! You
take
said
anymore.
rich can take from the poor. That was not the system I
Yes,
was proposing.
the owners can take from the workers. Yeah.
I mean, no, they're not taking from the workers. Both parties are profiting. I explained that earlier.
Right, according to your logic, I understand. According to my logic,
Do you have a
obviously,
flaw in my
it's a bit
logic?
different.
Can you find a flaw in it?
A flaw in your logic?
Mm.
Well, I mean, it's not grounded on materialist analysis. It's like, how do you find a flaw in
No, no, no.
religion?
I,
It's
I
like,
didn't
well,
ask. Can you
if
find where
proves
my
it's correct.
logic was not grounded in Marxian theory? I asked, could you find a
Yeah.
flaw in my logic? Which premise was incorrect?
Which premise was incorrect? About
Mutual profit in voluntary trade. Like,
mutual
what
profit
is...
involved in trade?
Yeah, so it's the example of me going to the ice cream man and buying an ice cream from him for $5. What is
Yeah.
incorrect about my argument as to why they both profit from that exchange?
No, I think they do both benefit from that exchange. I mean, I think a
Okay, so
slave owner
if
and a
they
slave
both
master
if they
both
both
benefit
benefit
from
from
it.
that exchange, then it is not the case that that workers are being taken from by the owners, by the capitalists. That is not the case, right? My system is not that they are being taken from. So then, what is the unsustainability of this system? Because you said the unsustainability was that there is a finite limit on how much can be taken from the workers, but we know that it's not actually being taken from the workers. Nothing is being taken from the workers. So what is the unsustainability?
Well, you can both benefit and still have something taken from you.
But you get something better in reward, in exchange, right?
Well, that's
You get
irrelevant.
something better.
It's irrelevant.
It's not irrelevant.
No, it is.
So where
If
exactly
if
does
if
this
what you
finite
get,
limit play in? Is there a finite
yeah,
limit of the number of trades I do? If I do 100 trades in a day, does God just come down and say, "Stop! You're no longer allowed to
no,
trade
but
today"?
there's a limit you can pay workers if you go any lower that it's going to cause them to not be able to work anymore. But also your profit
How
has
does
to
that make it
continue growing, so it has
unsustainable?
to continue growing. So your profit has to continue growing and it has to come from somewhere. And one of the easiest places they
No, it
get
does not
it
have
is
to continue
from
growing.
hiring
That does
prices and
not
not
follow.
hiring
It does
wages.
not follow that your profit has to continue growing by the fact that
Sure.
there's a
Well,
limit,
that was my
a
answer.
lower limit on how much you can pay your workers. It does not follow.
Right. Right. Well, that was my answer.
Okay. So from here, I guess just for the remainder of the episode, kind of, for the final section here, I kind of want to just basically, essentially pass the microphone to you, Jorge, and basically, from here, anything you'd like to say or anything you'd like to ask as questions, just anything that's kind of been on your mind and you wanted to speak on, as far as Marxism, sure. I mean, I just want to give you this opportunity to do that.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, I would just say that, I think um, I've had other uh, I've had other ANCAPs say to me that Marxist analysis of like class struggle was correct, but he just had an incorrect analysis of who the struggle was between. So I would just say that, I think that, uh, the most useful and effective analysis that we can use as a materialist, in a sense, especially a dialectical materialist analysis. And I really would want to ask Liquid Zulu if he would consider himself like an idealist or, a believer of metaphysical rather than dialectic thought.
Well, if the question is whether I believe metaphysics is a real thing, then yes, I do. I believe there is an actual study of metaphysics, and you can genuinely study the universe as a whole, the nature of the universe as a whole. You can actually study what there is. I would believe that, yes.
Okay, and about idealist, would you consider yourself an idealist?
What is the definition of idealism?
Idealism is someone who sees the ideas as the main determiner of the material rather than the other way around.
I would disagree with that entirely. That sounds like primacy of consciousness.
Okay, that was one of my main questions there. It sort of was answered by when you said that capitalism wouldn't have been possible 1,000 years ago. It's the material conditions which make things possible, not the ideas themselves. So,
No, not the material conditions. It's the ideas in people's heads which make a given system of politics possible. So it's the philosophy of the day which will determine which political system you have. It's not like economic conditions or whatever.
right, but what made those ideas possible? It was the material conditions, was it not?
Well, no. What made those ideas possible was whether people chose to think or evade. It was not,
So
they
the
weren't
ideas
determined to
already
think or
existed
evade.
beforehand. Before those people came up with the ideas, they already existed independently
Well,
beforehand. We just had to grasp them.
the origin of these ideas is ultimately in thought or evasion. That is the ultimate origin of all of them, which is not, you aren't determined whether you're going to choose to think or evade. That is a genuine choice you have.
Interesting. Okay. And I guess I just want to ask you real quick about the Rothbard, where he talks about, kids and dealing with the vagrants and the bums and quote unquote. Like he says that basically people shouldn't be compelled to take care of their kids, I think, and also, or like, also that there should be a baby market. People should be able to sell their kids, I believe. I mean, maybe I'm misinterpreting that, and you can clarify it. But
Sure.
also,
So I mean,
to
um,
unleash the cops and the bums on the, to unleash the cops on the bums and the vagrants.
Well,
sure. So on the first point of that people who should not be compelled to care for their kids. I think everybody agrees with this because adoption is a thing, right? You aren't compelled to care for your children. I'm not aware of anybody who thinks that you should be. In terms of the baby market thing, he's just talking about a market for adoption. They should be allowed to buy and sell guardianship over different babies. Rothbard says this explicitly, in fact, and I can bring up the quote where he says this. If you give me one moment. So yes, this is Rothbard saying, we must therefore state that, even from birth, the parental ownership is not absolute, but of a trustee or guardianship kind. In short, every baby, as soon as it is born, is therefore no longer contained within his mother's body, possesses the right of self-ownership by virtue of being a separate entity and a potential adult. It must therefore be illegal and a violation of the child's rights for a parent to aggress against his person by mutilating, torturing, murdering him, etc. Uh, and he goes on from that point. But I think that captures the character of it. As for the unleash the bums quote, unleash the cops on the bums quote, I'm not sure about the context there, but I mean, I address the open borders argument in a video on the matter where the homeless question comes up.
Sure, okay. I actually have one more. Is anything people do natural? Like, how do you determine what they're doing is natural or unnatural? Is it sort of just like if they stay within the, if they don't violate property rights, it's natural, and if they do, it's unnatural, or how does that work?
I don't think I made that distinction. Like,
Okay,
you mean
how
when
do
I'm
you
saying
determine?
there's natural property rights? Is that what you're referring to?
No, I'm asking, is anything humans do natural, or how do you determine what they do is natural or unnatural?
I probably wouldn't say that humans doing
first,
things is nature. I would say that it's warping nature because I hate nature. I think nature's bad. I think humans should destroy nature and make it better.
right. Yeah, I mean, I personally wouldn't even use the dichotomy of natural versus unnatural behavior. I mean, the vast majority of actions that we do are conscious and intended. A lot of what we do is, I mean, unless you're just having a stroke or a seizure and just convulsing, then, maybe that might not be consciously intended. But I mean, that's really the scope that I would use for measuring, the type of behavior there. But I wouldn't really categorize it as natural or unnatural, maybe just more conscious or subconscious. But even then, I would still consider both of those, the actual actions we take based upon that as still intended in that case.
Yeah, it's the purposeful versus non-purposeful dichotomy. That's a legitimate
Right.
dichotomy.
Right. Yes. So I mean, and going back to the topic of the bums and the vagrants in that case. I mean, the way I see it, it still comes down to a matter of property rights. In this case, let's say that somebody is, let's say somebody is, let's say that I have some people aggressing on my property, and and they're not supposed to be there. They haven't actually they're not supposed to be in that case. I believe I would have the legitimate right to have them removed via private security if they are trespassing on my own property. Um, and I mean, as far as where a lot of what bums and vagrants can do, I mean, we do. It's not that there would be no mechanism in society to assist these people. I mean, we have. I mean, there were back in the 18th, I'm sorry, the 19th century and the early 20th century, the fraternal lodges. In this case, that people would often use to provide for these people, and I would assert that a lot of these people that might be categorized as quote unquote bums and vagrants could potentially benefit from those as well, and through that they would still have a mechanism to essentially avoid being in a position where the cops would have to be, as Murray Rothbard said, unleashed upon them. So that's basically just my response to that.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So you think you said, I'm sorry, you said that there was going to be programs to like help them? Is that what you were
Well,
saying?
not so much programs. I'm just pointing to the fraternal lodges that existed at that point in history, where basically, they functioned as private institutions for people. So they could have functioned. Basically, somebody would pay a small price here. They could provide, for example, if somebody was out of, unemployed, for example, they paid unemployment benefits. But of course, there were, unlike today's, type of unemployment insurance, there were actual, conditions that the private agencies would set that they had to meet in order to receive that payment, and instead of just giving it out, and then also trying to incentivize them to stay unemployed in that case as well. So yes, basically, I would point to fraternal lodges as a good option for people who are destitute in society.
Interesting. Okay, well, I would definitely recommend looking into the ethics of liberty. I'm pretty sure that's the one where he said talks about unleashing the bums. I mean, as far as what I got from it, he sort of
And also
concludes.
without physical violence, obviously, as well. Sorry,
He
like I
sort of
wouldn't say like
concludes.
Does he say that in
Yeah, he sort
Ethics
of
of Liberty?
concludes.
I don't recall that.
I'm pretty sure that's the one it was. But or no, wait. It might have been a program for right wing populism or something like that. Was what it was called.
I would
Uh,
assume it's that one because I haven't read that one. Um, because
I think
I
that's the one
definitely
it
don't
was.
remember it from Ethics of Liberty.
It was very strange because I got linked to it as a joke at first. Like the ANCAP linked it to me because I asked him what to do about the homeless people when everything's privatized, and he linked to me that section where it just said unleash the cops, and then he like was like saying that it was a joke. But then I read the whole book and I was like, well, it doesn't in the context it doesn't seem like it's a joke. So like, I'm guessing his logic behind it is that like when everything is privatized, people who don't own anything we're gonna have to have a place for these people to go, and it's gonna be jail more than likely.
I mean, that
right,
would
I
contradict
wouldn't.
with everything else he said. He's an anarchist, right?
Right. I mean, in this case, and obviously, too, it goes without saying, physical violence would be a direct aggression upon the person who is trespassing. I would say simply to have them removed, in this case, to simply remove them from the property. But if you're just, beating them senseless, then,
Well,
obviously
when
that would be
everything is private, like where do you remove them to is the question.
right. I
Where
mean,
will they
basically,
go?
in
Who
this case,
cares? Right?
That's what it says. Yeah,
that's exactly
Yeah, who
right. That's
cares? Like if that's
yeah,
the
that's what it
interpretation,
says.
if
right.
that's what he's
Right.
meaning, where it's like, well, we're not going to let them just be a vagrant on somebody's property who doesn't want them there, then yeah, who cares where they go? They can find somewhere else to go.
Unleash. It says
Right.
unleash the cops and allow them to administer instant punishment or justice or whatever, which doesn't
If that
sound
means
very
physical removal, then
non-aggressive.
that's fine.
Right. Right.
It might be
Right. As long as
non-aggressive.
it's
You
not,
can
physically
non-aggressively
violent,
punish
then yes.
someone. Like if
Yeah.
right now I
Mm.
said, Jorge, I'm never going to be your friend, and if you really wanted to be my friend, that might be very punishing to you. You might be hurt by that, right? And I can instantaneously punish you in that way. It doesn't take a whole
Yeah.
lot of effort, but it's non-aggressive, right? I didn't violate your rights by doing that.
And Rothbard does say in that selection that any cop, in this case private security, who agency member who is acting beyond the scope of what is acceptable. If they are using physical violence, in that case where it's completely uninstigated, then they should be penalized for that. They should also face punishment in turn for that and have to face justice for their own actions there.
Well, there you go.
But I mean, I guess the problem is that in this case, their actions were just not owning property, so they should be penalized for that.
I don't know if
But
they're
no.
in
I
fact
think their
necessarily
actions aren't just not owning property; it's being on the streets and in the parks, right? If we're assuming these are private parks and private streets, then this is trespassing. I'm not allowed to just like walk on into your house and start sleeping on your couch and be like, "Hey, bro, what are you gonna punish me for not owning property?" It's like, no, I'm punishing you for being in my house. Get out. I don't want you here.
Right, but I mean, I think there's a difference between owning a people not coming to your house and people like existing on Earth.
I wouldn't say
I
necessarily
don't think
that.
he's going after just homeless people for being homeless. Like he's not saying,
Well, when the
all the
forests and the
tribes
rivers and
people.
the park, when everything is privatized, it's I mean, you might as well chip everyone so you can account where they are at all times to make sure they're not violating anyone's property at all times because
I mean,
they're
if
going
you're on
to.
some if you're chilling in like a forest or something, and somebody comes along and says, "Hey, I'm trying to build like a a shopping mall here? Do you mind moving? And it's the last place on earth where you can be. Just say, nah, I'm not going to move. What are they going to do?
Well, I mean, if they own the property, they're going to have police come and
How
arrest
would they
you.
own the property?
Well, everything's privatized.
No. I'm saying when they're trying to privatize these last sections, and you are stubbornly refusing to get a home at this point, when they are doing this, and you're sitting there in this forest, complete virgin land, and somebody comes along and says, "Hey, I'm trying to do construction here, so if can you move off of here?" And just say, "Nah, I'm not gonna," and then they can't homestead it.
Yeah, you'd hope not. But then again, they could have the
No,
biggest.
they can't. Not legitimately. Not under Rothbard's theory. They wouldn't be allowed to. They'd have to wait for the people to leave on their own.
Yeah. Well,
And
hopefully
there are
they.
plenty of stubborn holdouts who do this. Like, you see these pictures of like massive built up city and then just like a tiny little like village country home in the middle of it because they just never bothered to sell. Or not bothered, they just didn't want to sell. And all these people keep hounding them, sell, sell, sell. I'll give you 50
Well,
million,
I'm
I'll give you
confused.
100 million.
How is your solution of different smaller insurance agencies and firms correcting the bigger ones? Like, how is that better than or different than my answer of like purging the party?
Because my one has a market behind it. Why
Yeah.
Satisfy is better.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And when we look at private agencies as well, I mean, if we look at private streets, private parks, there's no inherent guarantee that they would be opposed to that they would immediately, expel any, bums or vagrants, to use that term. There could be some that would, certainly, allow those people to be a part of that. And even if we look at the fraternal lodges as well, if somebody is a part of those lodges could also provide, any coverage for any property rights as far as the streets or parks or whatever locations people might particularly attend to. If they have some type of, if they let's say that there's some type of deal with the fraternal lodge with the person staying there, they have them set up with some type of employment. If they need to get to the employment, naturally the lodge could also spring for any travel in that case as well, to cover that, to cover certain locations that they may have to attend to get to their actual place of employment.
So there's one thing I wanted to say in this video that I've come to the realization of recently was that, Plato, Aristotle, the various Greek philosophers were very much against democracy because of like mob rule. And I believe what they were actually was against was private property. Let me explain. So they're against the idea of like represent people representing or like voting, right? To sort of like supposedly acting in everyone's best interest, right? He says that it's going to be mob rule, they're only going to act in their own interest. And I think this stems from the philosophical basis of private property, where it's like every man for himself. When you have a society set up like, especially in time of slavery that they lived in, when you have a system set up like that, based like that, like to expect people to like, be able to, act in, the best interest of everyone else, it's like sort of acting opposed to the human nature that's been imposed on them by the system that they've lived in, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, so if only we had some proper Marxian mystic who could properly get the true mystic insights of the proletariat,
Exactly.
and then democracy would be fine. It's all
Exactly. Now
mysticism.
you're
It's
getting
all
it.
primacy of consciousness.
Now you're getting it.
We just needed the right
Yeah.
priests, and then suddenly religion is correct.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. So you do see class interest though, right? Like, would you say between like the government and the non-government or like state, non-state or
No,
whatever?
there isn't such a thing as class
Mm.
will. There isn't a group will. That doesn't exist. We're methodological individualists.
Would you say that they have like their own ideology that would like support their interest then?
Yeah, or they might share an ideology. And this is not just there isn't some specific structure of ideological differences that they must have. They could very easily share an ideology, and you'd expect them to, in fact.
Right. I mean, I know Mises speaks on, this type of, conflict between the individual and their overall class in portions of his book Theory and History, And there's an actual quote he has that he cites from the Communist Manifesto, where Marx acknowledges the same conflict, saying that the organization of the proletarians in a class, and consequently into a political party, is at every instant, again shattered by the competition between the workers themselves. So that quote there almost seems to also imply the same, individualist, drive that these same, people within a certain, quote unquote class may have. So, I mean, in this case, I often do look at it as, the idea of the class as a collective and the very nature of the individual as a reality constantly, at odds with each other.
So
And I
you
feel
guys
like
have said, you've said a few times that like, perhaps private owners will allow people to stay on their land, like various appeals to like, human nature. Would you say that the market, like in your guys' view, the free market is meant to correct the errors in human nature, and human nature is meant to correct the errors in the free market?
There are no errors in human nature that need correcting. The free market is there to most efficiently allocate scarce means. That's the purpose of the free market.
What would you say to that, Adam?
I would pretty much say the exact same thing there. Basically, that I don't see, human nature itself as flawed. I mean, I see human nature as fundamentally, acting in its own self-interest. And I believe that, that's just the reality of the world, and to deny that is just completely false. And I believe that, a free market is the best way of realizing that desire to act in one's own self-interest.
So I would say this is the difference between the materialist and the idealist conception of human nature is, to say that human nature is, inherently looking out for self-interest. If you were to say, because of the current conditions and like if the conditions change, then the human nature will change, that would be a materialist conception. But if you were to assert that, it will always be, this one certain way, I would say that would be the definition of an idealist conception of human nature.
I don't say being idealist necessarily. Like you could just say that nature doesn't change, right? It's human nature. It's the nature of humans. It doesn't change given different eras, because A is A. So your nature is your nature. Your nature under given different circumstances might yield different results, but it's still your nature. Your nature is the same.
Right. Yeah, well, no, I mean, it's pretty abstract. I mean, like, as far as what the nature actually is, I guess, would be more, less abstract, I guess, more to the concrete.
Well, I don't think there is inherent sin. I don't think you're inherently flawed for being alive, which seems to be what you're going for, where it's like there is some flaw in human nature and we have to correct for this or whatever. Nah, that's not the
No,
case.
all I've said was human nature was determined by the conditions. That it's
Again,
not
maybe I
some
misinterpreted.
fixed, like,
But I
it's
don't, I
not
don't
like
think
a
there is a
fixed.
flaw in human nature which needs to be corrected for by the free market.
No, I don't
I
think
think the
so.
free
I don't think
market is
so. I
just
think,
the most efficient way to allocate scarce means.
yeah, no, I guess I would just say that, like, my only problem would be Evan with what your statement when you said that it's like human nature is fundamentally looking out for the own self interest. If you think that's like a universal and will always be the case under any conditions, then that's what I, in Marxist, would call idealism. But if you would say that, you know, it's fundamentally they're about their own self interest right now because of the conditions, but that could change, then in our view, that's what would be a materialist view, and a dialectical materialist, more specifically, view of conception of human nature.
I mean, if you want to consider it, idealist in a Marxist sense, then, then so be it. I do believe that, that this is an unchanging truth, that, we act in our own self-interest, I mean, for example, I mean, Hawthorne would argue that, humans are fundamentally evil. Thoreau would argue that they're fundamentally good. I mean, I would personally dispute both of them and tend to get behind somebody like Ayn Rand in this case, basically saying that the, self-motivation is what drives people forward in this case. And like I said, I don't believe that that would be a changing force in this case, because that's just basically, how human beings are, fundamentally designed in their own
Yeah,
case.
I,
Like,
I'd say
they.
I think Ayn
I'm
Rand
sorry.
has the best, definitely the best view of man. I think you're correct there, where man isn't this snarling, awful beast like Nietzsche would have you believe. Man isn't this beautiful, perfect thing like some other people would have you believe. man has both the potential of Howard Rourke and of Peter Keating. Man has both these potentials within him. It's his choice what he goes for. I just think that's very, very beautiful.
Sure, I guess my only point is that like Marx's conception would be that man is not fundamentally or inherently anything. He's just, you know, what the conditions,
He has no
the
nature. He's a
condition.
blob. He has no identity. Yeah, this is the fundamental
No,
problem with these theories.
no, it's not. I wouldn't say that. No,
He isn't
I mean he
fundamentally
has.
anything. How is that not asserting the negation of the identity? Right?
Well, like, well, because it's based on the conditions. If like, let me just like give you an example.
Yeah,
Like,
but it's like
I would
he
say
isn't
that for
fundamentally
most,
anything on his own. He has no identity for himself. He has no specific nature of his own. So he's
well,
nothing
nothing is
on
anything
himself.
in and of itself. That's the point of
Exactly.
dialectic.
Yes,
Nothing.
exactly.
It's all
Exactly.
connected. Yeah, it's all connected. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
You can't
You're
understand.
saying
You
that
can't
there is no
understand one
identity.
thing.
So
No,
when
I'm
you
not. It
say
has an identity, but
so
you
when you
can't
say everything
understand it
has
in separation
contradictions,
from its
I think you
environment.
actually do mean that in the
Yeah, so
logical
I didn't
sense.
say that. I
Maybe
actually
you
didn't say
don't
that. I said you
realize you
can't
mean
understand
that.
its
I think you're
separation from
probably
its
just parroting
context.
Hegel or something, but that is what it means. Nothing is anything on its own. It's all in a big flux, in a big Heraclean flux. Everything is contradictions and all these things. Nothing has identity to itself. Law of identity falls, existence falls, all of it falls on this view. That is the
Sure,
problem here.
sure. That's not how I would interpret it, but I appreciate your response. Yeah. So interesting. Okay. I mean, the last thing I kind of like, one thing I wanted to cover was like unequal exchange a little bit, but I mean, if you consider this system like the efficient and the best, and like you've already said, I guess the inequality and unequal exchange is sort of like, inherently still, I guess not unequal because they both benefit in the end. So like, I mean, by that logic, you could even claim that slavery was like, uh,
No, because slavery
like,
is involuntary.
Mhm.
So my argument breaks
that's
down when you have
irrelevant, but they both
involuntary
benefit.
exchange.
Well,
They
No, no,
both
no, no, no,
benefit
no.
from it.
I
well,
want to be clear.
mm,
My argument specifically only applies to voluntary exchange because it presupposes that both parties chose the exchange. They chose to take the other thing in exchange for what they already had. If they don't choose it,
Right, but
then yes, they might actually value what they already have more than what they're given. So slavery is not necessarily mutually profitable.
well, the problem is that your conception of coercion is sort of arbitrary. Like I would,
And
like
that's not I
I,
explained it
at least I
earlier
guess
with the law, with the
I
whole
guess it,
tirade about the law of the jungle and mixed law and all that. It's not
yeah, because
arbitrary
from
at
at
all.
least from a Marxist conception, I would say that living in a society and not having living in human society, which is supposedly the richest, most advanced nation of all time, and not having access to basic human rights is a form of coercion. I would say because we don't live in
Oh,
the jungle. Like it's fine to say in a jungle. Yes, I understand. If we all live in the jungle,
so
there's
I
no
want to be clear.
guarantees
When
for
I said
anything.
law of the jungle, I didn't mean this applies only to if you live in a jungle. I meant this is just a complete whim worship system. It's a complete whim-based legal theory, right? It is not based on. There aren't any statutes up there. It's just follow, might makes right, do whatever the hell you want. Nothing matters. That's what is meant by the law of the jungle. There is only one rule in the law of the jungle: do whatever the hell you want.
Well, I guess the only point I'm trying to make was that at least slaves and peasants were like guaranteed an existence, whereas the proletariat is not. I mean, how could you say that this is a higher and more advanced system and stage of progress of history when at least then they were
I don't think
guaranteed
I
their
made any
existence?
claims about which stage of history is a higher level of progress. I don't think I did that.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, the efficiency, I mean,
Hold on.
yeah, that is tricky because I mean, I do, for example, think that this is a better, more advanced stage, but still I recognize that at least under those stages, you know, they are guaranteed food and housing,
right. I mean, the way I see it, we can put even if we put the issue of whether exchanges are equal or unequal aside. I mean, any market exchange by its very nature has to at least be voluntarily agreed upon. If it's not voluntary, then it's not. I wouldn't call it a market exchange to begin with. It is just flat out theft at that point, and it loses all legitimacy as exchange.
Right, but my point, I guess, is like Do you, okay, I guess this is like one way I've kind of approached this is do you think Jeff Bezos would work for you for like minimum wage, $15 an hour?
No, he seems very productive. I don't know why he'd work for that little.
So, like another way I guess of putting that would be that he's not as vulnerable, he's not as exploitable.
No, that's not the way of putting it, because you're not exploiting somebody by hiring them.
Well, that's the way I would put it.
Well,
Is
the
he's
way
not
you
in a
put it is
vulnerable
wrong.
position. He's not in a vulnerable position to vulnerable enough to like work desperate enough to work for you for $15 an hour.
You could say
So,
desperate, or you could say in
Might not have the
non-productive enough. He's
experience.
very productive, so why on earth would he choose less productive work? Like, it's not very productive to be cleaning toilets, but it's very productive to be running a massive international logistics empire. That's very productive.
sure.
But, his wealth is definitely inflated by IP. So, with that caveat on there.
Sure. So Engels has a quote where he says that to put humans in a system such as capitalism or private property, and say that greed or self-interest in this case is their nature is synonymous with putting a worker in a polluted factory and saying that coughing is their nature. And that's sort of his explanation of like the dialectical materialist conception of human nature, that it's dependent on the conditions and not on like a preconceived, notion of it.
I would definitely disagree with that. But I don't think I don't think it's that. I don't think there is this human nature to be greedy or anything. Boy, I wish there was. But I don't think there is. Um, I think a man fundamentally has a choice in the matter. It's not determined by his conditions or by what he is or anything like that. Well, it is determined by what he is in a way, but like he has a choice over how he is, over whether or not he's virtuous or vicious, because vice comes from vicious. I think he has a choice in the matter. I don't think it's just determined by his material conditions or anything like that.
Sure, yeah, I would say that that's sort of like where the dialectical aspect comes in, as opposed to a mechanical materialism, which says that everything is like pretty much already predetermined.
I don't really think material conditions have much of a say on the essentials at all. Like the essentials come down to whether or not you're thinking or evading, whether you're a thinker or an evader. Those are the essentials. Like whether or not you can come to some specific conclusion. Like I think Ayn Rand said that she would not be able to come up with objectivism before the Industrial Revolution because she wouldn't have been able to integrate the fact that you basically that reason is the sole means of man's survival. Because back in like Aristotle's day, it used to be the case that people thought, well, there's these basically two different ways you can use mind. You can use it for the more base, like survival tasks, like farming and mining and stuff like that. But then there are these more intellectual pursuits which seem completely disconnected from nature. But it's after the Industrial Revolution that you can see, no, actually, it's all the same thing. It's all reason. All these, like, supposedly intellectual pursuits are still fundamentally aimed at man's survival. Uh, so it all comes down still to thought and evasion versus evasion.
What's your thoughts on that, Evan?
Well, yes, I mean, I basically, I don't see that, self-interest and greed should necessarily be conflated with one another. I believe that, self-interest, going on with what Zul was saying, is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing morally. In this case, it could manifest itself depending on the person themselves and, as far as their different virtues, I mean, self-control. I mean, we see, Jordan Peterson, for example, talking about how, a good man is not harmless. He's basically a dangerous man who has that under control. That's just one concept there. And I believe that that's only answering about half of your question. I apologize. What was the other half of it?
Basically, do you think that, okay, let's at least start with, I mean, do you think that it's not, you know, a bit contradictory, let's say, to put someone in a polluted factory and then say that it's their nature to, maybe cough or get cancer or whatever?
Well, in this case, I would say that, if obviously we can follow from cause and effect that if somebody is, put into a polluted factory for an extended period of time, then naturally they would, cough and, have their cancer and different, symptoms such as that are the likely outcome in this case. And I would say that exposing somebody to that could certainly be considered an aggression as well, which is why I believe as well that, that we have different, dispute and the DIO and, agencies in this case could potentially, we could seek arbitration, in cases such as that. So I mean, the idea that we can't have we can't preserve people's safety through these types of processes of air pollution or things like that could still just be as easily attained under anarcho-capitalist conditions as well, just done through more of a private mechanism rather than through the state.
And so just like try to pry in a little bit on when you said that the private owners of the parks may let people stay there, like how much weight do you put on that? Like why do you think it'll happen? Like what's gonna happen if that doesn't happen? Like
Well, like I was saying too, I believe that the fraternal lodges as well could also provide that. They would have a direct incentive to do that. If they are working with certain businesses and they're able to provide certain employees there, then naturally they could provide. They could work with anybody that they would need to on their way to work, or certain people that uh, they would need to do business with in order to get to their own form of work that they would have set up for them. So that could be set up through the fraternal lodges. But if we're talking directly through the businesses themselves, the parks, I mean, they may not have a necessary incentive to necessarily bar people from their parks or streets as long as they're not creating any type of disturbance. But really, that would be up to the actual private owner themselves. That would be up to their own voluntary choice in that case.
okay, all right,
I mean, I
and
can't speak on what they would absolutely do or what they might do, but that would really be, up to them at the end of the day. That would be their decision.
and why do these lodges not exist now? Is it because of the state, or is like what's stopping it from happening now?
Yeah, the state got rid
Yes, a
of
lot of the
them.
fraternal, yeah,
Welfare
Wasn't
state came in and
hmm,
drove them out. You also have the American Medical Association, which
right,
stopped the
portraying a
lodge
lot of,
practice. So yeah, like they were driven out by the state.
right, lodge doctors were portrayed as quacks basically by the American Medical Association.
interesting. Okay, so the history of like the reliability and the I guess the word of like the practicality of anarcho-capitalism is sort of like Marxism. Like, because for me personally, like the greatest criticism like I can think of against Marxism is like, how is it going to find a way to defend itself against imperialism and against the capitalist, armies that come to try to destroy it? Like how is it going to actually manage that and not, devolve into, counter-revolution, corruption, bureaucracy, whatever? Like, for me, that is the best question, of like, of Marxism and for Marxism is how are you going to navigate those challenges? And like, it hasn't like, uh, obviously to a acceptable degree yet. I mean, to a degree that, it has proven itself in a lot of areas to, but as far as like uh, balancing defending yourself and not becoming sort of like authoritarian at the same time, I think is one of the best criticisms there is of Marxism. And it sounds a little bit like you're having a similar problem yourselves with the anarcho-capitalists because it's like, how is your institution like that going to defend itself? Is like, like a very practical question.
Guns.
You say guns?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Yeah, like it's not the anarcho-capitalist's role to explain the exact intricacies of the system which would obtain under anarcho-capitalism. That's the entire reason why we need a market in the first place, because we can't say uh, we aren't these top-down planners who are going to explain the exact location of every coffee shop and the exact location of every defense service and the exact means that they're going to employ. We can't say these things. We understand that the Marxists don't. So it's unanswerable for the Marxists, but they claim that they can answer it. That's the distinction.
Right, it's not a question of how things would work, but really just a question of how things could work under anarcho-capitalism.
Interesting. Okay. Um, yeah, well, I mean, that's really my final statement. My closing is, would be we cannot assess the quote failures or successes of any socialist, project or even a union. I mean, success of unions, without the supposed, quote free market that you guys, uh, advocate for. So, hope maybe we can get that, and then from there, the socialist countries and unions won't face any repression, and then we can actually, uh, flourish. So maybe your guys is the first step to communism. Who knows?
But I just think it's hilarious talking about socialist societies not being repressed when socialism involves repressing people and stopping them from doing what they want. So it's like, just leave us alone.
Mhm.
And then we want to aggress against people and stop them from doing what they want. Just leave us alone so that we can not leave other people alone. It's like, there's an inherent contradiction there, in your sense and in mine.
Mm.
It's completely incoherent.
Yeah, yeah, I can see
Okay.
why you would think that.
Okay. So, I mean, overall, I think we've had a pretty productive conversation over the past couple of hours here. I think, we've really laid bare the ideologies of Marxism versus the ideologies of anarcho-capitalism. And, I think, we can all, I think, anybody watching this and listening in can extract a lot of, information from that. So with that said, I just want to give, many thanks to Jorge and Liquid Zulu for appearing on the show. And, thanks to everybody for tuning in as well. This has been Morgan Meets the Eye. So make sure to follow Jorge, Liquid Zulu, and myself on social media. Subscribe, comment, and above all, keep asking why. Everybody out there, have a good one. Bye-bye.